chains clinked with every step, heavy iron biting into blistered wrists. We were marched through corridors that stank of oil, rust, and something far worse, something human. No one spoke. Speaking wasn't allowed. Even the guards didn't talk, their vox masks hissing with each mechanical breath, as if the air itself was poison. I saw them take prisoners before, heretics, deserters, and unlucky civilians caught in the wrong place. None came back. None were ever spoken of again. Some said the commissars shot them. Others whispered the Mechanicus took them for repurposing. But the truth was worse. The cells were not cells. They were holding pens, stacked like cages in a slaughterhouse. Some prisoners wept. Some laughed with cracked voices that sounded broken inside. A few simply stared, eyes wide, as if they'd already seen what awaited the rest of us. Because in the Imperium, being a prisoner doesn't mean you're alive, it means you're inventory. The world was ash before we even realized we were lost. Smoke turned the skies into a permanent dusk, and the battlefield itself was a graveyard too fresh to bury. We were told we would hold the line. That was the commissar's promise, barked with certainty before the artillery began. But when the ground shook with the first barrage, when the trenches turned into rivers of mud and gore, when Vox signals dissolved into nothing but static and screams, we understood the truth. Holding the line meant nothing. We were abandoned. I remember the moment it happened, the exact second the war stopped being ours. We had been fighting for hours without water, without food, with our lasguns burning hot and our throats ragged from shouting over the thunder of shells. The air was so thick with smoke and dirt that even the flares overhead looked like dying embers, their light choked by the weight of the sky itself. And then, not shouted through the Vox, not bellowed by an officer, just whispered from man to man, as if saying it too loud might make it false. We stumbled through the ruined trench lines, half blind, half dead already. No formation, no pride, just the desperate shuffle of men who didn't want to die with their faces in the mud. That's when they found us. Not the enemy, not at first, the Arbites. They emerged from the fog like shapes carved from iron, black carapace armor gleaming in the firelight, visors red with reflected flame. Their shock mauls glowed faintly as they advanced, and behind them loomed heavier figures, Ogren auxiliaries, their collars studded with control nodes, massive arms chained in restraint clamps that could be removed in an instant. Stand down. The voice boomed from a Vox grill, metallic and cold, carrying no human sympathy. We froze, not because of obedience, but because we knew exactly what they were. The Emperor's law did not recognize the word surrender. To fall back without sanction, to retreat without orders, these were not mere crimes. They were heresies, and heresy was never forgiven. One man, Orlin, I think his name was, didn't listen. He broke into a sprint, mud flying under his boots, breath rasping as he tried to vanish into the smoke. The Arbites didn't even aim. One lifted his shock maul, pressed the trigger, and a bolt of blue-white energy spat through the air. Orlin screamed once, just once. Then his body locked, twitched and fell into the sludge, smoke rising from his armor as his flesh cooked inside. We didn't move again. They bound us in chains, each link heavy enough to remind us that we were no longer soldiers, just cargo. The Oberons dragged those who resisted, slamming them into the mud face first until their teeth shattered. The Arbites didn't waste words, didn't offer explanation. They didn't need to, because we all knew. Prisoners in the Imperium do not return. The march began at dusk, but dusk meant nothing anymore. The sky was a smear of fire and smoke, a wound that never healed. Each step pulled the chains tighter around our wrists, biting through skin, opening sores that would fester long before anyone thought of tending to them. We passed through the trenches where we had fought, now abandoned except for the dead, their bodies slumped against the wood, eyes staring through the fog as though they were watching us, pitying us. In places the ground still smoked, still bled from artillery strikes that had churned earth and flesh into the same substance. A commissar rode alongside the Arbites, his greatcoat unmarked by mud, his bolt pistol gleaming at his hip. He didn't look at us. He didn't need to. His silence was worse than words. His presence meant judgment was already decided. We were not prisoners of war. We were failures, and failures in the Imperium are fuel. The column wound through the shattered battlefield until the ground sloped upward, carrying us to the ruins of a hab block that had once been part of a thriving city. Now it was nothing but hollow shells of concrete, their faces eaten away by fire. The Arbites herded us inside, past walls stained black with soot and charred handprints that reached upward as if begging for release. The holding chamber was no chamber at all, just an empty floor, once a manufactorum floor perhaps, now turned into a corral. There were already others inside, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dim light of a single hanging lumen, their faces drawn tight with hunger and exhaustion. Some stared blankly at the wall, some muttered prayers under their breath, lips cracked and bloody. A few laughed soft, broken laughs that carried no joy, only madness. When the Arbites shoved us in, the crowd shifted but did not react. Prisoners didn't greet new prisoners. Not here. Here you were already half dead when you arrived. The chains were not removed. We were left bound, herded like cattle. Guards lined the entrance, weapons ready, visors blank, and then the waiting began. Time died in that place. The lumen flickered without rhythm, casting shadows that crawled along the walls like insects. Somewhere above us, machinery groaned, gears grinding as if the entire ruin still remembered its old function, but could no longer perform it. The air was thick with sweat, with the stench of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Hours passed, or maybe days. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned. No one spoke, because speaking only reminded you of your own voice, of your own humanity, and that was something best forgotten here. Then the door opened. It wasn't Arbites this time. It was worse. Men in robes entered, their garments stained with oil and blood, their faces hidden beneath masks of polished steel. Their hands twitched with mechanical precision, fingers clicking as if driven by servos. The Mechanicus. They did not speak. They simply pointed. An Arbite stepped forward, seized a prisoner by the chain, and dragged him toward the robed figures. The man screamed, kicked, begged. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, but none of us moved. None of us spoke, because we already knew. Those taken by the Mechanicus never came back. We watched as the man was hauled through the doorway, his voice fading into the distance, swallowed by the ruin's belly. The door closed, and the silence that followed was worse than his screams. It meant he was gone. Inventory. That night, I think it was night, I dreamt of what they would do, of flesh peeled away and replaced with steel, of voices stripped out and replaced with vox screams, of eyes hollowed into sockets for lenses. And when I woke, sweating, throat raw, I realized the truth. This was not capture. This was not punishment. This was not even justice. This was processing. We were no longer men. We were resources, and resources were meant to be consumed.
The chains spoke for us when we could not. Each step, each shuffle, each forced stumble through the dark was answered with the rattle of iron. It was the only voice we had left, a chorus of shackled men reminding themselves that they were still breathing, if only just. They had moved us again. No warning, no words. The Arbites entered the corral like shadows from another world, shock mauls humming low, their visors glowing faintly red in the half-light. A signal was given, silent, and the Ogren auxiliaries lumbered forward, snapping the chains loose from the floor and fastening them instead to long iron rods. We were yoked together like cattle, shoulder to shoulder, one line of meat ready to be dragged into whatever abyss waited for us next. March. The order was unnecessary. The rods jerked, the Ogrens heaved, and the line lurched forward. Stumble too far, and the chain tore your wrists open. Fall, and you dragged the man beside you down. Weakness was punished not by a commissar's bolt pistol, but by the indifference of the chain itself. We learned fast. The corridors we passed through smelled less of rot and more of oil. The walls gleamed with moisture, condensation dripping steadily into rust-stained channels beneath our boots. Sometimes sparks leapt from broken conduits above, painting the shadows with brief flashes of blue. The Arbites never flinched. They walked through sparks and dripping filth as though they were ghosts, their boots silent on the metal grating. But us, every sound became a weapon against our minds. The groan of pipes, the hiss of steam, the crackle of distant power fields. The silence between those sounds was worse, because silence meant thought, and thought meant remembering. I remembered the field, the orders,
The way the commissar's gaze never lingered on us, even as we died in droves. I remembered Orlin's body smoking in the mud after he tried to run. His scream lasted less than a heartbeat, but it had branded itself into my skull, echoing louder in silence than in sound. And most of all, I remembered what came after, the Mechanicus in their robes of rust and blood, choosing us as if we were livestock at a market. The chain jerked, snapping me back. A man in front had stumbled. His knees hit the grate with a hollow clang, his breath torn from him in a ragged cry. The Ogren to the side moved fast, faster than his bulk should allow. A massive hand seized the man by the collar and yanked him upright like a doll. The prisoner gasped, blood running down his wrists where the iron had bitten too deep. He whispered something. Apology, plea, prayer. It didn't matter. The Ogren shoved him back into line. The Arbites did not even look. We marched again. Hours blurred, perhaps days. Time meant nothing here. No sun, no stars, no measure beyond the ache in our bones and the dryness of our tongues. Hunger burned slow, but thirst was a blade. Every breath scraped the throat. Every swallow begged for water that would not come. Some men muttered words of faith, reciting the Emperor's litanies through cracked lips. Others stared straight ahead, faces blank, as though belief had already fled them. And me, I listened, to the chains, to the silence between them, to the way even the Arbites did not speak, their orders carried through gestures alone. It was as if sound itself had been outlawed here. When the silence broke, it was not by words but by screams. The sound came from beyond the wall to our right, muffled, twisted, but unmistakable. A cry of agony, shrill and ragged, echoing down pipes and ducts like a ghost that could not find its grave. Another voice followed, deeper, broken by sobs. The Arbites did not turn. The Ogrins did not pause. Only we, the chained, faltered. I saw one man's lips move. He mouthed a single word. Why? None of us answered. None of us dared. The Arbites herded us down a wider corridor, one lined with doors of steel. Each door bore marks, scratched symbols, numbers etched by blades, stains that had sunk into metal too deep to scrub away. Some doors bulged outward, as though something had once thrown itself against them from the inside. Others bore claw marks, long grooves carved into the steel by fingernails or something worse. We passed one door just as the screaming inside it ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that swallowed all noise. Then, a thump, heavy, final. The Arbites gave no sign they had heard. We were herded instead into a chamber that might once have been a mess hall. The tables were gone, the benches stripped, leaving only bare floors and walls that smelled of disinfectant, poorly masking older stains. Chains anchored to the floor divided the room into rows. We were locked into them, each man with no more space than a coffin. The silence pressed down again, thicker than before. It was broken only by whispers. Not ours, theirs. The guards spoke softly now, words carried through vox grills in tones too low for us to catch. They gestured to one another, pointing at us, their red visors flashing with faint redouts. I caught fragments of sound, binary bursts, half syllables, clipped codes, not speech meant for men. Somewhere above, machinery rumbled, a conveyor's groan, a piston's hiss. The entire building trembled with the rhythm of machines that never slept. And then came the first selection. The doors opened, and figures in robes returned. Not the Arbites, not Ogrins. These were thinner, stooped, their movements jerky with mechanical rhythm. Masked faces gleamed, optics flickering red and green, limbs augmented by augmetics that hissed with every twitch. Tech priests. They moved like butchers through a pen, their gaze falling on each of us in turn. One would pause, point a clawed finger, and the Arbites would seize the chosen man. Chains were unlocked only to be replaced with heavier ones, collars fixed around throats, clamps biting into flesh. The chosen were dragged away. Some wept, some fought, some begged. None came back. Each time the doors closed, silence filled the chamber again, heavier, denser, as if the walls themselves were suffocating us. The only sound was the chains, rattling softly as men trembled where they sat. One man broke the silence, better dead. His voice was raw, cracked, but clear enough for all of us to hear. Heads turned.
Even the Arbites shifted slightly, though they said nothing. The man's eyes were hollow, his face gaunt. He pulled against his chains, wrists bleeding anew, and repeated it louder. "Better dead." The Arbite nearest him moved fast. A shock maul hummed, lifted, and struck down. The man convulsed, foam bursting from his lips. His scream cut short as electricity arced through him. When he fell, twitching, smoke rising from his body, the Arbite reset his maul without a word. The silence returned, but the words lingered. "Better dead." I felt them echo in my chest, a truth I dared not admit aloud, because deep down, we all knew, chains were not meant to hold prisoners. Chains were meant to deliver offerings. We were not men, we were not soldiers. We were silence bound in iron, waiting to be claimed, and in that silence, the only mercy left was death.
The first thing you notice is not the smell, not the heat, not the chains biting into your wrists, nor the iron collar rubbing your throat raw. The first thing you notice is the eyes. Hundreds of them, staring out of sockets that are too wide, too bloodshot, too hollow. Men, women, soldiers, civilians, it didn't matter anymore. In the holding pens there were no uniforms, no ranks, no families. There was only the gaze of the already damned, looking at you as if you were the one who'd come too late. They put us here after the corridor march. Another journey through endless steel, down stairwells that descended so far you could swear you were walking into the planet's heart. At every landing there were doors sealed with sigils of the Aquila, some broken, some fresh, some marked in a script I didn't recognize. Behind a few of them, faint scratching could be heard. Behind others, whispering. But here, in the pens, there was no need to imagine what waited. It was already laid bare. The pens were cages, nothing more. Square chambers divided by rusting bars. Floors covered in straw, long since turned to rot. The air was thick with the stink of human waste and sweat, a haze that clung to the skin like oil. The only light came from lumens fixed high above, their glow faint, their buzz constant. Each cage was packed until no one inside could move without pressing against another body. Some sat, knees to chest, eyes blank. Some stood, swaying with exhaustion, too afraid to collapse lest they be trampled. And some simply lay where they had fallen, breathing shallowly, waiting for a death too slow to be merciful. When we were herded in, shoved through the bars like beasts, the prisoners barely reacted. A few shifted to make space, their movements mechanical, empty. One man looked up long enough to whisper something under his breath, words too faint to catch. Another just laughed softly to himself, rocking back and forth as if cradling an invisible child. The Arbites locked the gate behind us with a clang that echoed across the chamber. That sound, final, metallic, absolute, was worse than any sermon. It told us what we already suspected, that the pen was not a place of waiting, it was a place of ending. Hours blurred. The chains at my wrists rubbed until the skin tore open. Flies swarmed in the dark, feeding on wounds, crawling across lips too dry to spit them away. Somewhere a woman coughed until her body shook, and then she did not cough anymore. No one moved her. There was no room to move her. The silence was not total. There were always sounds. Whispers muttered as prayers. The shuffle of feet as men sought comfort they would never find. The low sob of someone who had not yet learned the truth. And always the distant noise of machinery, grinding, whirring, clattering like the belly of some great beast, digesting its meal. It was not long before they came, the tech priests. They walked between the pens in pairs, their robes dragging across the filth without stain, their masks gleaming in the weak lumen light. The air around them smelled of oil and ozone, sharp and acrid, cutting through the stench of decay. Their voices never rose above a hiss of Bonaric cant, streams of code clicking and buzzing like insects trapped in their throats. When they stopped, all of us froze. One raised a mechadendrite, its claw twitching and pointed. The Arbites moved instantly, unlocking the gate, dragging out whoever had been chosen. Chains rattled, voices broke into pleas, but it didn't matter. The chosen were dragged across the floor, through the gates, into the corridors beyond. None ever returned. We tried not to watch. We tried not to think of what happened in those places where the screams came from. But the pens had no walls for mercy, no corners for hiding. You saw everything.
You heard everything. And worst of all, you imagined everything. There was a boy, couldn't have been more than 16 Terran years, who whispered that he had heard stories. He said the mechanatus took the prisoners to repurpose them, that the flesh was stripped away, that the mind burned out, until what remained was a body that obeyed, a servitor. He breathed, voice cracking, eyes darting as though saying the word might summon them. The older men spat at him, called him a liar, but they didn't deny it. No one ever denied it, because we had all seen servitors before, in the manufactorums, in the trenches, in the hospitals, those blank-faced things with augmetic arms and soulless eyes. They had been men once. And where did the Mechanicus get their men? Here, from us. The boy didn't last long after that. When the tech priests came again, their optics scanned the pen, pausing on him, a mechadendrite extended, claws twitching, and that was all it took. He screamed, begged. His voice was high, shrill, cutting. He cried for his mother, for the Emperor, for anyone. The Arbites beat him until he could barely walk, then dragged him away. His voice echoed down the corridor, until it cut off all at once. And in the silence that followed, I realized I was grateful. Grateful it had been him and not me. That was the truth of the holding pens. Mercy didn't exist here. Not faith, not hope, not loyalty. Only the sick relief of watching someone else go instead of you. Days passed, or maybe weeks. The pens had no clocks. The only measure of time was the number of people left in each cage. Fewer and fewer. Every day, every hour, men died where they sat, slumping against bars that had pressed into their flesh for too long. Their bodies were dragged out by the Arbites without ceremony, dumped onto carts that smelled of rust and old blood. Sometimes the tech priests took the corpses too. Sometimes they didn't. No one ever asked why. One night, if night existed in this place, the lumen above us flickered out. The chamber sank into darkness, so total it felt like drowning. I couldn't see my hands, couldn't see the man chained beside me, could barely feel the walls. Only the sounds remained, breathing, whispering, the faint clink of chains. And then, beneath it all, something else. A voice, not human, not Arbite, not Mechanicus, a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, too soft to catch, too low to resist. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the chains pulled tight, digging deeper into torn flesh. The whisper slithered through the noise, curling around thought, curling into it. Words I did not understand, syllables that tasted like ash. Others heard it too. I know they did. Men shifted, muttered, whimpered. Someone began to sob, loud, ugly, desperate. The Arbites shouted once, striking their mauls against the bars, sparks flying in the dark. The whisper stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse, because silence meant it was waiting. The pen was never meant to be the end. It was a place of waiting, a warehouse of flesh. And like all warehouses, eventually the stock must be moved, processed, repurposed. We didn't know when our turn would come. There was no schedule, no logic to the choices. One day it would be the boy too young to shave. The next it would be the old man whose chains cut so deep they had fused into his skin. And sometimes it would be three at once, dragged out together, screaming into the dark. But sometimes it wasn't the tech priests who came. Sometimes it was them, the interrogators. The Arbites would open the gates at dawn, if dawn even existed in a place without windows. Their visors glowed red in the dimness, shock mauls humming like insects in the silence. They would gesture, wordless as always, and the interrogators would glide in. You could tell them apart immediately. The Arbites were armored, blunt instruments of law. The tech priests were butchers, surgical and cold. But the interrogators, they were artists. They dressed in black, always black. Long coats buttoned to the neck, gloves that never revealed skin, boots polished until they shone in the flickering lumen light. Their faces were pale masks, smooth porcelain with no features except eye holes dark as tombs. No mouth, no nose, no expression. They didn't need them. When the interrogators came, they did not point, they did not speak. They simply entered the pen, one at a time, and stood among us, silent, watching. The first time it happened, no one breathed. We sat pressed together, chains clinking faintly,
as the figure's eyeless mask turned slowly from face to face. It was as if it could see everything. Your memories, your sins, the things you whispered in the dark when you thought no one listened. And then, with a motion so sudden it made my heart lurch, the interrogator reached out and touched a man on the shoulder. That was all. The Arbites moved in instantly. Chains snapped loose, manacles replaced with heavier ones, the prisoner's collar locked tighter. He didn't even struggle, he just sobbed softly, as if he'd known all along that he would be chosen. They dragged him out into the corridor. The interrogator followed, boots silent on the filthy floor. The door slammed. We never saw him again, but we heard him. The walls were not thick enough to stop the sound. Hours later, muffled at first, then clearer, as the screaming grew louder, we heard him. Words jumbled together in a torrent. Names, places, oaths, denials. He swore he was loyal, that he had never faltered, that he prayed every morning and every night. His voice cracked, broke, shattered. Then came the other voice, cold, measured. A whisper carried through some kind of amplifier, too distorted to recognize as human. It asked questions, not shouted, not demanded. Asked. Soft, patient, endless. The man screamed louder. We covered our ears, pressed our faces against our knees, prayed to the Emperor for silence, but prayers were not answered here. When the screaming finally stopped, it was not because the man had run out of words, it was because the interrogator no longer needed them. The next time they came, it was worse. 2 of them this time. Masks gleaming, coats swaying. They moved through the pen like predators through a herd. They didn't look at us, they looked into us. I swear I felt it like a hand rooting through my skull, tugging at memories I didn't even know I still had. One stopped in front of a woman. Her hair was matted, her eyes wide. She whispered prayers under her breath, louder and louder, clutching at her chains like they were rosary beads. The interrogator tilted its head, listening. Then it touched her chin, lifting her face to the mask. Her prayers turned into screams. No one touched her, no one moved her, but her body convulsed, thrashing as though something invisible had crawled inside her skin. The Arbites rushed in, shackled her, and dragged her away. She didn't stop screaming until the door closed. We sat in silence, not out of respect, but out of fear, because we knew, if they could do that with a single touch, what else could they do in the chamber beyond? The days blurred after that. Sometimes the tech priests came, sometimes the interrogators. We never knew which was worse. At least with the priests, you imagined steel and wires, but with the interrogators, you imagined yourself, your secrets, your lies. I saw a man break before they even touched him. When the mask turned toward him, he began to shout, confessing to things none of us believed. He admitted to stealing rations, to abandoning his post, to worshipping false gods. His voice rose higher and higher, until it cracked, and until it dissolved into sobs. The interrogator just stood there, listening, then it turned away. The man kept shouting, even after they left, until his voice was gone, and his throat was blood. He died 2 days later, eyes staring wide, as though the mask still hovered over him. It wasn't always Arbites who came with them. Once it was a commissar. His coat gleamed, his bolt pistol heavy at his side. He walked among us like a vulture, lips curled in disgust. When the interrogator pointed, the commissar himself stepped forward, seized the chosen prisoner by the collar, and dragged him out. Confession, he said flatly, his voice like iron, or execution. We never saw which. The interrogators did not come every day, but their absence was no relief. It only meant we were left with silence. Silence that stretched so long you began to hear voices in it, voices that weren't there. One man whispered that the interrogators were not men at all, that beneath the masks were psychers, sanctioned and bound, their powers weaponized into instruments of truth. Another said they were inquisitorial acolytes, trained to peel the soul apart with nothing more than a glance. Someone else swore they weren't human, that the masks hid faces no mortal should see. None of us knew, none of us wanted to, because the truth didn't matter, only the chains did, and the silence, and the waiting, always waiting for the moment the mask would turn, the hand would reach, and you would be the one dragged into the dark. The interrogators never hurried, they never raised their voices, they didn't need to. Their art was patience, and patience is the cruelest blade.
We were all bleeding already. They just decided when to make the cut.
The Mechanicus did not wait for silence. They brought it with them. When the tech priests came, the chamber's whispers always died. The Arbites never spoke anyway, but even the prisoners, half mad, half dead, mumbling prayers or curses into the dark, would fall quiet. Not because they wanted to, because something about the priests demanded it. They smelled of oil and ozone, the stink of machine spirit offerings baked into their robes. Their footsteps clanged not like men's boots, but like tools striking steel. And when they moved with the twitching certainty of something that had been programmed rather than born. The first time I saw them up close, I wanted to believe they were still human, that the faces under those bronze masks, half hidden beneath respirator tubes and optics arrays, were flesh and blood like mine. But then one of them bent to inspect the locks on our chains, and his robe slipped back, and I saw the truth. His arm wasn't an arm at all. It was a piston wrapped in cables, a joint that hissed steam when it flexed, plates of iron bolted where skin should have been, and his other hand, if you could call it a hand, ended in 3 surgical blades, slick with oil, twitching as though eager to cut. He saw me staring, his optics whirred, lenses narrowing. For a heartbeat, I thought he might open me up right there on the floor, but instead he turned away, his blades clicking like teeth as he gestured to the Arbites. 3 of us were taken that night. They didn't scream when the Arbites dragged them away, not because they were brave, because they knew screaming was useless. The tech priests had no use for sound, they only wanted silence, and silence was all they left behind. When the interrogators came, there was a chance, however slim, that you might return, broken, shattered, hollow-eyed perhaps, but still breathing, still yourself in some way. But when the priests chose you, you were gone forever, not dead. That would have been mercy, changed. They called it repurposing. I don't know if that was an official word, or just the one we whispered when we dared to speak of it at all, but the meaning was the same. Flesh into tool, thought into function, a man into something that obeyed without question. We had all seen servitors before, lumbering through manufactorums, carrying crates in the holds of troop ships, standing half-melted into cogitator banks in command bunkers. We never thought of where they came from. We never wanted to. Now we knew. One night, or what passed for night here, a sound reached us from the corridor beyond. Not screaming. Screaming we could endure. This was worse. It was a voice, flat, monotone, reciting a code string in binaric cant. The syllables were mechanical, each one repeated exactly the same way, over and over, with no pause, no falter, no human flaw, and I knew that voice. It belonged to one of the men taken 2 days before. I'd heard him whisper prayers in the pen. I'd heard him cry for his children. His voice had cracked then, trembling with weakness, thick with tears. But now it was hollow, drained of everything but obedience. Alpha 3-7, subroutine. Confirm. Alpha 3-7, subroutine. Confirm. On and on, until the Arbites dragged another prisoner out, and the voice cut off mid-syllable, as if switched off by a cogitator's command. I don't know what was worse, the screaming that echoed for hours, or the silence when it stopped. The hunger of the machine never slowed. Each day, or what felt like a day more, were chosen, their faces blurred in my memory, lost to the sameness of despair. The priests pointed, the Arbites dragged, the chains clinked, and then there was only less of us, always less. And sometimes they brought them back, not whole, not human. I saw one once, dragged into the chamber by 2 Arbites, his feet dragging, his eyes blank, metal jutted from his skull, cables coiled around his arms. His jaw had been replaced entirely, teeth torn out and refitted with a Vox grill that crackled as he breathed. The Arbites shoved him into the pen. He didn't resist. He didn't move at all, except to twitch when the cables hissed. One of the men whispered his name. Joust, I think it was. A soldier, brave once. The servitor twitched again. Then, without warning, his Vox grill spat static. Error. Subroutine. Error. Subroutine. Flesh. The word ended in a crackle. He convulsed, metal clamps sparking,
Before collapsing onto the floor, smoke rose from his body. The tech priests came at once. They did not run. They did not need to. They moved with perfect certainty, bending over him, mechadendrites clicking. One inserted a blade into his neck. Another pried open the grill. The third reached into his chest and twisted. The body went still. The priests stood, wiped their tools clean, and gestured for the Arbites to drag what was left away. No one spoke for hours. The priests didn't just take the weak, or the strong, or the defiant. They took all kinds, soldiers and deserters, civilians and psychers, men who prayed and men who cursed, women who wept and women who stared blankly into the dark. It didn't matter who you were, because to them you weren't a person. You were material. Some became labor units, stripped of identity, reduced to muscle and bone, wrapped in augmetics. Others were fused into machines, their brains wired into cogitators, until their screams became calculations, and some became warnings. There was a woman once, pale, hollow, her eyes sunken deep. She was chosen in silence, dragged away without resistance. When she came back, she was no longer human. Her arms had been replaced with mechanical limbs ending in clamps. Her eyes were gone, replaced by glowing optics that whirred as they focused. Her mouth was sealed shut, skin grafted over it, leaving only a grill where her throat should have been. The Arbites brought her back into the pen. They didn't unshackle her. They didn't need to. She stood there, silent, motionless, until one of the men whispered her name. Her head snapped toward him. The optics glowed brighter. And then, without warning, she lunged. The clamps crushed his skull before anyone could react. Blood sprayed across the bars. Screams erupted. The Arbites rushed in. Shock mauls raised. Electricity crackled. The servitor convulsed, collapsing in a heap of twitching steel and flesh. The tech priests followed. They inspected her body, muttering Benaric streams. One adjusted a dial on her skull. Another sliced her chest open and rewired something inside. Then they left her there, motionless again, watching us, waiting for the next command. That was when I understood the truth. The machine did not hunger for flesh alone. It hungered for obedience. It wasn't enough to kill us. It wasn't enough to break us. It had to make us part of itself. Every scream that echoed through the halls, every voice drained into a monotone, every body turned into a tool, it was all part of the same endless consumption. And the worst part wasn't the fear of being chosen. The worst part was the hope, because every time the priests entered, every time their optics scanned the pens, part of me prayed they would point at me, because then at least the waiting would end. Faith does not die easily. Even here, in chains, in filth, in silence broken only by screams and steel, there were still those who whispered the Emperor's name. Some prayed to him for deliverance. Some prayed to him for forgiveness. Some prayed simply so that their own voices might remind them they were still human. But the ecclesiarchy did not tolerate faith spoken too freely, because in the holding pens faith was not comfort. Faith was evidence. The first priest came without warning, not a tech priest of the machine, but a priest of the creed. His robes were crimson, his shoulders heavy with golden trim blackened by soot. He carried no weapon, only a staff topped with a burning censer that filled the air with choking smoke. He was flanked by two sisters of battle. Their armor was scarred but gleaming, their helms off so that we could see their faces, faces hard as stone, eyes that carried no pity. Bolters rested in their hands, muzzles pointed down but ready, always ready. The Arbites stepped aside when they entered. Even the tech priests paused in their muttering, mechadendrites twitching like insects disturbed by fire. The priest's voice rolled through the chamber, heavy with ritual, weighted with words that had been spoken countless times before. Faith is the fire that burns the heretic. The censer swung, filling the air with smoke that clung to our throats, thick and acrid. Men coughed, choked, but the priest continued, his voice rising above the sound. Faith is the hammer that crushes the traitor. He stopped before one of the pens. His eyes, black as coal, swept across us. For a moment I thought he looked at me. For a moment I thought I had been chosen. Then he raised his staff, and the censer's smoke flared bright. Faith is the chain that binds the weak to his light. The sisters moved. Their bolters snapped up.
aimed at a man kneeling in the corner of the cage. His lips moved, whispering prayers, his eyes wide with terror. "Show us your faith," the priest said softly. The man stammered, words spilling over themselves. He swore he was loyal. He swore he had prayed every day. He swore the Emperor's name louder than he ever had before. The priest only watched. The man's voice broke. He sobbed, clutching at his chains, begging for mercy. The priest turned away. The bolters fired. The roar filled the chamber, deafening in its suddenness. The man's body was torn apart, chunks of flesh spattering the bars. His prayers ended in a gurgle drowned by the fire of the God Emperor's wrath. The silence that followed was total. Not even the tech priests muttered. The priest turned back to us, smoke curling around his face like a halo of ash. "Faith that survives fire," he said, "is faith that is true." Then he left. After that day, faith changed in the pens. Prayers were no longer whispered openly. They were mouthed silently, lips moving without sound, eyes closed tight in the dark. Faith became a secret, not a shield, because if the priests of the creed heard you, they did not see devotion. They saw fuel. More priests came in the days that followed. Some carried censers, some carried whips, some carried nothing at all but their voices, and their voices were enough. They would walk among us, demanding confessions. Who had doubted? Who had faltered? Who had sinned in thought, in deed, in silence? Men turned on one another, pointing, shouting, spitting accusations. Brothers betrayed brothers, wives damned husbands, not because they wanted to, because silence was seen as guilt. Better to condemn another than to be condemned yourself. And always, the sisters watched, bolters ready, flamers primed. There was a day I will never forget. They brought us into a larger chamber, wider than the pens, its walls blackened by soot, its floor littered with ash. Iron stakes rose from the ground in neat rows, blackened at the tips. At first, I thought they were remnants of some machine, twisted pipes left to rust. Then I saw the bones, charred, brittle, fused to the stakes themselves, and I understood. This was not a chamber for holding, this was a chamber for burning. The priest's sermon rang through the air, his voice amplified by hidden speakers until it pressed against the walls themselves. Doubt is heresy, fear is heresy, failure is heresy. With each word, the censer smoke grew thicker, flames crackling in its wake. Prisoners coughed, gagged, fell to their knees. The sisters moved among us, dragging some forward, binding them to the stakes. The chosen wept, begged, cursed. It did not matter. The flames were lit. I can still hear them scream. Their voices rose in a chorus of agony, a hymn of fire and smoke, their bodies thrashing against the stakes until only ash remained. The smell clung to us for days, burning into our skin, into our lungs, into the memory of everything we had once believed. And the priest smiled, because to him their deaths were not cruelty, they were worship, who believed that to burn in the Emperor's light was to be closer to him. They begged for the flames, pressed their faces to the bars, shouted prayers until their voices cracked. Some were given what they wanted. They died with smiles, their flesh melting as they whispered the Emperor's name. But some were left alive, because true faith, the priest said, was not eager for death. True faith endured. Those who begged were left to rot in the pens, their prayers ignored, their faith mocked as weakness. That was the lesson of the ecclesiarchy. Faith was not yours to give, it was theirs to take. And then came the relics. One day, the priest entered, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He placed it on a table in the center of the chamber, unwrapped it slowly, reverently. It was a skull, human, bleached white, its eye sockets black pits. Gold leaf glimmered faintly on its surface, etched with the aquila. This, the priest said, is Saint Aurelian's skull, he who burned the heretics of Virus with his own hands, he who died in fire so that we might live in faith. The prisoners were forced to approach one by one. Each was ordered to kneel, to press their lips to the bone. Some did so without hesitation. Some hesitated. Some refused. The ones who refused were dragged to the stakes. The ones who hesitated were beaten until they kissed it. And the ones who obeyed without pause, I do not know what became of them. Some were taken by the tech priests, others by the interrogators. A few remained, eyes glassy, as though something in the skull had entered them and never left. Faith and fire. That was the ecclesiarchy's gift. They didn't care if you believed. They didn't care if you doubted.
They only cared that your body, your soul, your ashes served as proof. Because in the Imperium, faith is not comfort, it is currency, and prisoners are worth nothing unless they burn.
The ecclesiarchy left us with fire. The tech priests left us with silence. But the commissars left us with something worse, certainty. Because when a commissar entered the pens, there was no mystery in his judgment. There was only the gun. The first one arrived on a day that felt no different from the others. Our lumen flickered above, the air smelled of rust and sweat, and the silence was thick enough to choke. Then the door slammed open, and boots echoed across the chamber floor. He was tall, his greatcoat crisp even in this filth, the red trim gleaming faintly under the lumen's dying light. His cap was pulled low, the aquila glinting on its brim. His face was sharp, lined not with age but with discipline carved so deep it looked eternal. At his hip hung a bolt pistol. Its casing was polished, its barrel unblemished, its magazine fresh. It was the cleanest thing I had ever seen. The Arbites saluted as he entered. Even the tech priests paused their muttering, optics turning toward him for a moment before returning to their work. The commissar didn't return the salutes. He didn't need to. His very presence was salute enough. He walked along the pens slowly, deliberately, eyes sweeping across us like a surveyor inspecting a mine for weak points. His gaze lingered on no one in particular. And yet, when it passed over me, I felt as though he had already judged me guilty. When he stopped, it was in front of a man whose chains had cut so deep his wrists were raw bone and blood. The man looked up, lips trembling, eyes hollow. The commissar said nothing. He simply drew his pistol, pressed it against the man's forehead, and fired. The bolt round detonated with a roar that shook the chamber. Blood and bone spattered across the bars, across our faces, across the floor. The man's body collapsed, twitching once before lying still. The commissar holstered his weapon, turned, and continued walking. No sermon, no explanation, only certainty. That was the first execution I witnessed in the pens. It was not the last. The commissars returned often, never at regular intervals, never with warning. Some days it would be the tech priests who came, some days the interrogators, some days the priests of the creed. But sooner or later, a commissar always arrived, and when he did, someone died. It wasn't always immediate. Sometimes they questioned first. Why did you falter? Why did you abandon the line? Why do you still breathe when your comrades lie dead in the mud? The questions were not meant to be answered. They were meant to be nails driven into the coffin of your guilt. A wrong word, a stammer, a hesitation, any of these was enough. And then the pistol spoke. Some tried to argue. They shouted that they had fought bravely, that they had obeyed orders, that they had bled for the Imperium. They recited prayers, quoted litanies, begged the emperor for witness. The commissars listened. Sometimes, their faces never changed, their eyes never softened, and then they pulled the trigger anyway. Others didn't argue at all. They begged, they sobbed, they threw themselves at the commissar's boots, promising to fight again, to redeem themselves, to serve in the penal legions, anywhere, anything. The commissar would let them beg until the words ran dry. Then he would fire, because mercy was not in his vocabulary. We learned quickly that survival under the commissar's gaze was not about truth. It was about silence. Those who kept their eyes down, their mouths shut, sometimes lived. Not always, but sometimes. Enough to teach the rest of us the lesson. Do not speak, do not look, do not exist, be nothing, because the commissar only shot those he could see. One day, they brought us out of the pens. We were marched into a larger chamber, chains rattling, Arbites flanking us, tech priests muttering in the shadows. At the center stood a platform, and on the platform the commissar. This one was younger than the last. His coat was still crisp, his boots polished, his face smooth except for a thin scar across his jaw. His pistol gleamed, loaded and ready. Before him knelt 10 prisoners. Their hands were bound behind their backs, their heads bowed. The commissar raised his voice, carrying easily through the chamber. These men abandoned their posts. They faltered in their duty. They brought shame upon the emperor's service. His voice was not loud.
It didn't need to be. Every word was clear, sharp as a blade. They will be an example. He drew his pistol and executed the first man, then the second, then the third. He did not rush, he did not hesitate. He fired, waited for the body to fall, then stepped calmly to the next. When he reached the 10th, his pistol clicked. The magazine was empty. He reloaded slowly, deliberately, the sound of the fresh magazine locking into place, echoing across the chamber like a death knell. Then he fired. 10 bodies lay in a row, heads shattered, blood pooling across the stone. The commissar holstered his pistol and looked at us. "This is mercy," he said, and then he left. Mercy. That word haunted me more than the screams, more than the fire, more than the silence. Because to the commissars, mercy was not sparing a life. Mercy was killing quickly. Better a bullet than the tech priest's blades. Better a bullet than the interrogator's masks. Better a bullet than the ecclesiarchy's fire. Men began to pray for the commissar's bullet. They whispered their sins louder, hoping to be chosen. They spat on the emperor's name, knowing it would mark them. They threw themselves against the bars, shouting defiance, begging for death. Sometimes the commissars obliged, sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, those men were dragged away by the Arbites, their voices breaking as they realized the truth. The bullet was not punishment. The bullet was release. One night, I think it was night, the commissar came alone. No Arbites, no tech priests, no sisters, just him and his pistol. He walked slowly, boots echoing, his eyes scanning the pens. Then he stopped. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked. No one answered. His hand moved to his pistol. The sound of the holster's clasp opening was louder than thunder. "Do you know why you are here?" he repeated. This time, a man spoke. His voice was weak, trembling. "Because we failed." The commissar nodded once. "Correct." He drew his pistol and shot the man in the head. Then he holstered it, turned, and left. What when I understood? The commissars did not come to punish us. They did not come to judge us. They came to remind us that we were already dead. The bullet was just the emperor's way of making it official. The pens emptied slowly, man by man, soul by soul. Some were burned, some were shot, some were cut apart and made into something else. But there were others, those who did not go to the fire, or the bullet, or the machine. They went somewhere worse. They went to the black ships. They slid under doors, through vents, carried on voices that weren't voices at all. They filled the air with sounds no tongue could shape, syllables sharp as broken glass, soft as silk, all at once. At first I thought it was just my own mind cracking, but then I saw others stir when it came. Heads turned, eyes widened, hands clawed at ears already raw from chains. Some wept, some laughed, some muttered answers to questions none of us could hear. The psychers, I hadn't realized how many of them were among us. Some wore the tatters of guard uniforms, their eyes always too wide, too bright. Others were just civilians, their faces gaunt with hunger, but their gazes fixed on something far beyond these walls. And some were children, thin, hollow-eyed, trembling in silence as if they knew what they were. The whispers found them first, always them. They would scream suddenly, convulsing against their chains, their voices rising into shrieks that didn't sound human. Some babbled nonsense, others recited prayers in voices not their own. I saw one boy's mouth move in perfect sync with a prisoner 3 cages away, their words matching syllable for syllable until blood spilled from both their lips. And then came the black ship crews. They didn't mutter like the tech priests, voices buried in static. They didn't preach like ecclesiarchy priests, or execute like commissars. They glided, draped in robes so black they seemed to drink the light, their faces hidden behind masks of iron. They moved with the silence of things that had no weight at all. Where they walked, the air grew colder, breath misted, chains rattled softer, even the Arbites shifted uneasily. They never spoke, not in words we could hear, but the psychers reacted to them instantly. Some screamed louder, some fell silent, some pressed their foreheads against the bars and whispered, "Thank you." The black ship crews carried rods topped with sigils that pulsed faintly, their lines shifting like something alive. They would stop before a pen, lift those rods, and the psychers would convulse. Some fought,
Some begged, some laughed, but all were dragged out in the end. Their chains were heavier than ours, thicker, etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dark. Iron muzzles clamped their mouths, and collars dug into their throats, sparking faintly when they resisted. The children screamed the loudest. I still hear them sometimes, even now. We didn't know where the black ships took them. Not then, not fully, but we had heard the stories. Everyone in the Imperium has. Whether they admit it or not, the black ships collect psychers. They scour worlds, drag the cursed and the gifted from their homes, and vanish into the void. Some are trained, sanctioned, allowed to live as long as they serve. Others are fed to the Golden Throne itself, their souls devoured to keep the Emperor alive one more day. That was the truth every child in the Imperium grew up knowing. But knowing it in words, in whispers, is not the same as watching it happen. Not the same as watching a little girl, no older than 10, scream as her eyes rolled back, as her mouth foamed, as the air around her shook with something you couldn't see. Not the same as watching a black ship crewman clamp a muzzle over her face, her screams cut off into a strangled gurgle as she was dragged away into the shadows. Not the same as watching her mother, chained beside her, sob until she couldn't breathe, begging the Arbites to take her too. They didn't. They never did. The black ships only took the psychers. The rest of us were left behind to wait for our own ends. But the psychers didn't always go quietly. One night, the whispers rose louder than ever before. They filled the chamber, pressing into our skulls until men clawed at their eyes just to try and let the sound out. The lumen overhead burst, showering sparks, plunging us into near darkness. And then one of them broke. A man, thin, hollow, eyes wild, screamed. Not words, not sounds, just a raw scream that shook the air. The bars of his cage shuddered, the chains binding him cracked. Prisoners around him convulsed, blood spraying from their noses and ears. I thought the world was ending. Then the black ship crews arrived. They moved faster than I had ever seen them, their rods blazing with light that seared my eyes. They advanced in silence, robes swirling, masks gleaming. The psyker thrashed, his body twisting in ways that should have broken him. His mouth opened, and a voice that was not his own poured out, deep, resonant, too vast for one throat to hold. The words made no sense, but they burned in my bones. The crews surrounded him, their rods flared, the runes etching themselves into the air, and suddenly the man's scream turned into a wet gurgle. His body convulsed once, then collapsed. Smoke rose from his mouth, thick and black, curling upward before it vanished. The crews did not pause. They shackled what was left of him, dragged him away, and left us in the dark. No one spoke for hours, because we knew the black ships didn't just take psychers, they took whatever lived inside them too. The worst was when they took them in groups. Dozens at once, chained together, their muzzles clamped, their collars sparking. They shuffled through the corridors like a parade of ghosts, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling, their lips moving in prayers none of us could hear. And we watched them go, knowing that every one of them was lost. The children, the soldiers, the beggars, the prophets, every one of them. Sometimes, as they passed, one would look at us. Their eyes would lock with ours, pleading, screaming without sound, "Help me," but no one could. We were chained too. We were all chained. One day, the crews came for a boy in our pen. He was maybe 12. His eyes were dark, his lips cracked, his body too thin. He never spoke, never prayed, never cried. When the crews pointed their rods at him, he didn't resist. He just looked at me and smiled. It was the only smile I had seen in weeks, maybe months. They muzzled him, collared him, dragged him away. I never saw him again. But sometimes, in the silence, I swear I hear his voice, not screaming, not praying, whispering, like he's still there, just beyond the wall, smiling in the dark. That is what the black ships left us with. Not screams, not fire, not bullets, but the knowledge that the Emperor himself feasted on souls, and that someday, if you were unlucky enough, your own soul might be on the menu. The black ships took the psychers, the commissars took the failures, the ecclesiarchy took the doubtful, the tech priests took the flesh. But there were others who came for us. Ones the Imperium did not send, ones the guards pretended not to see. Chaos always finds the cracks. It began with marks. At first they looked like scratches, etchings on the walls of the pens, lines carved into rust and stone. I thought they were tally marks, the kind prisoners scratched to count their days. But then I saw the curves, the loops, the spirals. Not numbers, not words, symbols. They spread quickly. On the walls, on the floors, even on the flesh of prisoners. One man's arm split open with rot, and beneath the scab, lines burned bright like ink freshly carved. He screamed, clawing at his skin, but the marks only spread. Another man whispered that the symbols came in dreams. He said he saw them etched in fire across the sky, in blood across the ground, in his own shadow when it stretched against the wall. And then he began to draw them. He used his blood first, smearing it on the floor, then his teeth, carving them into the bars. When he ran out of space, he carved them into his own flesh. The Arbites ignored it. The tech priests ignored it. Even the commissar ignored it. But we didn't. We watched the symbols grow, and with them, the whispers. Not the psycho whispers, not the ones that bled into the mind from the warp itself. These were different. These whispered promises. You will be free. You will be powerful. You will not die forgotten. Some prisoners laughed them off. Some spat, muttering prayers louder than before. But some listened, and the ones who listened began to change. It started small. A man who never prayed began to recite litanies in reverse. A woman who never spoke began to hum songs that made our teeth ache. A child who had been silent for weeks began to laugh, the sound bubbling up from her throat like boiling water. At first, we thought they were mad, and maybe they were. But madness in the Imperium has a way of turning into something more. The man's eyes turned black one night, bottomless pits that reflected no light. The woman's voice deepened until it sounded like a choir, dozens of throats singing through her mouth. The child's laughter never stopped, even when she bit through her own tongue and blood frothed from her lips. And still the Arbites did nothing. I realized then that they knew, they always knew, because not all prisoners were meant to be purged. Some were meant to be bait. The first death came during the silence between screams. We were all pressed together, chains biting deep, when one of the marked men convulsed. His body snapped against the bars, bones cracking, blood spraying from his mouth. Then he stopped and smiled. His hand shot out, faster than it should have been, grabbing the throat of the prisoner beside him. The man choked, kicking, but the grip didn't loosen. It tightened. His eyes bulged, his face purpled, until his neck snapped like brittle wood. The marked man dropped the corpse and laughed. Not his laugh. A laugh that filled the chamber, echoing from the walls, rising higher and higher until it felt like it was inside our skulls. The Arbites moved at last. Shock mauls crackled, striking him again and again, but he didn't stop laughing, not even when his body collapsed in a twitching heap. The marks on the wall glowed faintly that night. Chaos doesn't need permission, it only needs opportunity. And here, in the pens, opportunity was endless. Every day, men died. Every night they dreamed. Every moment was a prayer waiting to be corrupted. It didn't take long before there were more marked. One by one they whispered. One by one they carved. One by one they bled. And one by one they changed. Their eyes grew too wide, their smiles too sharp, their voices too sweet. They promised us freedom if we listened, if we followed, if we believed. Some resisted, some prayed louder, clutching their chains as if iron could ward off the warp. But others leaned closer, others whispered back, and when they did, the marks spread faster. One night, the walls shook, not from artillery, not from machinery, from something else, something inside. The marks flared red, glowing like wounds. The prisoners marked by them began to convulse, their screams harmonizing into one voice, a voice that wasn't theirs. The Arbites stormed in, but it was too late. The marked prisoners rose, their chains snapping like twigs. Their flesh bubbled, their bones cracked, their bodies twisting into shapes that should not exist. One sprouted arms that tore through his own ribs, clawing at anything within reach. Another's mouth stretched until it split his skull in half, teeth gnashing like saw blades. The child's laughter rose louder, higher, until her skin peeled away, and something with too many eyes crawled out. Chaos had come. The chamber erupted into slaughter. Arbites swung mauls,
sparks flying, bolts roared, shredding flesh and bone. Tech priests chanted binoric prayers, their mechadendrites slicing through mutated throats. The commissar fired again and again, his voice iron, his pistol never missing. But for every one that fell, another rose. Blood sprayed across the bars, coating the floor in slick crimson. Prisoners screamed, trying to pull back, trying to vanish into chains that would not let them move. Some were torn apart, some were devoured, some simply stared, their minds already broken. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering, my breath ragged. I prayed, not for the Emperor, not for salvation, but for invisibility. Do not see me, do not choose me, do not touch me. And somehow, I lived. When the last of the marked fell, torn apart by bolt of fire and iron claws, the chamber was silent again. Silent except for the sobs of the survivors and the hiss of the Arbites as they reset their mauls. The commissar wiped blood from his coat, his eyes swept across us, cold and sharp. "This," he said, "is why mercy is death." Then he left. The tech priests followed, dragging the corpses of the marked. Some still twitched, their flesh pulsing with life that wasn't life. The priests cut them open anyway, wiring their bodies into silence. The Arbites scrubbed the walls with fire until the marks were gone, but they weren't gone, because they were still inside us, inside our dreams, inside our whispers, waiting. That was when I learned the truth. The Imperium fears chaos. The Arbites, the commissars, the priests, they all kill to stop it, but in places like this, they need it. They let it grow. They let it fester, they let it bloom just enough to remind us what waited if we faltered. Because nothing binds a prisoner tighter than fear of becoming something worse, and nothing makes you cling to the Emperor harder than the shadow of his enemy.
Pain was the only truth that never lied. That was the doctrine here. That was the catechism carved into flesh, until it bled, screamed, broke, and finally confessed. The interrogators had been artists. The priests had been zealots. The commissars had been executioners. But those who came now were something else entirely. They were believers. Their tools hung at their belts like relics, knives, pincers, brands, whips. None of them spoke at first. They didn't need to. Their doctrine was not written in words. It was written in pain. The Arbites brought them in like priests at a procession. The prisoners chosen that day were dragged out one by one, wrists bleeding against iron, collars sparking when they tried to resist. They were chained to stone slabs in the center of the chamber, their mouths pried open by clamps that held every scream for all of us to hear. The hooded men worked slowly. They never rushed. Every movement was measured, deliberate, almost reverent. A knife sliding under a fingernail, a brand pressed against bare flesh, a lash cracking against the spine until blood sprayed across the floor. Each cut was a sermon, each burn a psalm, each scream an amen. And always, always, the same words whispered afterward. Confession is salvation. The first man lasted an hour. He denied everything. He swore loyalty to the Emperor, swore he had never faltered, swore he would die before betraying his faith. His voice cracked but never broke. The hooded men didn't argue. They didn't call him a liar. They simply worked. A knife across the cheek, a brand against the chest, a nail driven through the palm. And when his voice finally shattered into sobs, they leaned close, whispering softly, "Confess." He confessed to things none of us believed. He confessed to abandoning his post. He confessed to worshipping the dark gods. He confessed to spitting on the Emperor's name. He confessed because pain demanded it. And when he had nothing left to confess, they slit his throat. The body was left on the slab for hours, the blood pooling around it, before the Arbites dragged it away. That was only the beginning. Every day after, they came, sometimes for one prisoner, sometimes for many, sometimes for all of us, lined up in rows, forced to watch as the doctrine was preached in blood. We tried not to listen. We tried not to watch, but the screams filled the chamber, echoing through the bars, crawling into our skulls until they were all we could hear. They branded words into flesh: heretic, coward, traitor. They carved the Aquila into backs, into faces, into tongues. They whispered questions as they worked, questions no one could answer correctly. Why did you run? Why did you doubt? Why do you still live when others died? The answers didn't matter. The questions were the point. Because pain was the Emperor's truth, and only through pain could you prove your loyalty. Some prisoners broke quickly. They screamed confessions before the first cut, begging for mercy, offering names, prayers, anything. But mercy never came, because confession was never the end. It was only the beginning. Once you confessed, they asked for more. Who else had faltered? Who else had doubted? Who else had whispered blasphemy in the dark? Men turned on each other. Brothers accused brothers. Mothers accused sons. Whole pens tore themselves apart, each prisoner spitting names to save their own skin, and the hooded men wrote it all down, not on paper, not on cogitators, on skin. They carved names into prisoners' backs, shoulders, thighs, lists of the damned written in blood and scars. When those prisoners were dragged out, the names went with them, and when they screamed their confessions, those names echoed back into the chamber. We learned quickly, you could not hide. Even silence was guilt. I thought the worst was the screams. It wasn't. The worst was the silence afterward. When the victims were dragged away, the chamber seemed too empty. The echoes of pain lingered, filling the air long after the blood had dried. Men sat in chains, staring blankly, their lips moving without sound. Some prayed, some wept, some just rocked back and forth, their eyes gone, their souls already confessed away. And in that silence, you wondered, what would I say when the knife touched me? What would I confess when the brand burned me? What lies would I scream when the lash opened my spine? And worse, would I believe them? One day, they brought a prisoner back. That had never happened before. He was dragged into the pen, still chained, his flesh raw, his body broken. His back was carved with words so deep the wounds still bled. His face was half burned, his lips split, his eyes glassy. He sat in the corner, rocking, whispering to himself, "Confession is salvation. Confession is salvation. Confession is salvation," over and over, never stopping. When another prisoner tried to speak to him, he lunged. His teeth sank into the man's throat, tearing it open, blood spraying across the bars. The Arbites struck him down instantly, shock mauls crackling, but he never stopped whispering, even as he died. Confession is salvation. That phrase spread through the pens like a sickness. Some whispered it with him, some shouted it in their sleep, some carved it into their own flesh with broken nails and teeth, not because they believed it, because they were afraid not to, because if pain was doctrine, then silence was heresy, and heresy was worse than death. The hooded men never hurried. They came as often as the priests, as often as the commissars, as often as the tech priests, and every time they proved the same truth, that torture was not about extracting information. It was not about finding traitors. It was not about rooting out heresy. It was about faith. Faith in pain. Faith in fear. Faith in the Emperor's judgment written in blood. Because in the Imperium, doctrine is not read from books. It is carved into flesh. And prisoners are the parchment. If fire did not claim you, if the bullet did not choose you, if the knife did not carve you hollow, then the Imperium had one more use for you: work. Because prisoners were not just bodies to be purged. We were fuel, and the Imperium's machines never stopped hungering. The first time they took us out of the pens for labor, I thought it was freedom. Not true freedom, not release, but escape from the stench, the darkness, the endless weight of chains pressing you into the stone. But when the chains were fixed to iron rods again, and the Ogrins dragged us into the light, I realized freedom had nothing to do with it. The light was not the sun. I don't think I remembered the sun anymore. It was lumen strips burning harsh white across cavern ceilings, so high they disappeared into shadow. The space was vast, a hollowed-out wound in the world itself. And it was filled with prisoners, thousands of them, men and women chained together, lines stretching across the cavern floor like veins. They dragged carts piled with ore, with rubble, with corpses. They swung pickaxes into stone until their hands bled. They fed coal into furnaces that belched smoke so thick it stung the eyes. They carried bricks, timber, steel beams until their backs snapped under the weight. The sound was a living thing, the clang of metal on rock, the groan of chains, the crack of whips, the bark of Arbites shouting orders. And beneath it all, the cough of lungs choking on dust,
the sobs of those who had nothing left, the moans of the dying trampled underfoot. This was not labor, this was execution by work. The Arbites patrolled the lines, shock mauls ready, overseers, men in stained uniforms, some prisoners themselves given privilege to command, walked among us, lashing whips across backs too slow, too weak. Tech priests stood near the machines, their optics scanning, their mechadendrites adjusting valves and pistons. To them, we were not people. We were extensions of the machines, flesh cogs turning iron gears. And always, always there was smoke. It clung to your skin, sank into your throat, burned your eyes until tears cut paths through the grime on your cheeks. Breathing felt like swallowing ash. Every cough brought blood. Every exhale tasted like rust. Some collapsed within hours. Their bodies were dragged to the side, dumped in piles like waste. Some were thrown into the furnaces directly, their screams muffled under the roar of fire. No one paused. No one looked. Work did not stop. Work never stopped. We were divided into crews, each crew chained together at the waist, each responsible for a section of the mine, a furnace, a line of carts. If one faltered, all suffered. That was the cruelty of it, because hate grew faster than hope. When a man stumbled, the chain dragged his crew with him. When he collapsed, the Arbites punished all of them. Whips cracked, mauls sparked, and men turned on the weak with fists, with teeth, with curses, not because they hated him, because they hated dying for him. I saw crews beat their own to death, their fists breaking bones, their boots crushing throats, just to rid themselves of weakness. The Arbites did not stop them. Sometimes they watched, sometimes they smiled, because nothing saves the Imperium more resources than prisoners killing each other. The work was endless. We mined until our arms split open, hauling rocks that cut us down to bone. We shoveled coal into furnaces until our faces blistered from the heat. We carried beams so heavy our spines cracked, leaving men paralyzed on the ground. There were no shifts, no rest, no water except what was thrown at us like slop, fouled and stagnant. No food except grey paste dumped in troughs, thick with insects. Men fought over it, men killed over it, and when they did, the Arbites laughed. Some prisoners tried to escape. I remember one man clearly. He was strong, larger than most, his muscles thick even after weeks of starvation. He broke his chain on a jagged rock and ran, his bare feet pounding across the cavern floor, his breath ragged but desperate. He didn't make it 10 steps. A sniper's shot rang out from above. His skull burst like rotten fruit, spraying brains across the stone. The body twitched once before it was dragged away, carted off to the furnaces like waste. The work did not pause, because nothing paused here. Sometimes the ecclesiarchy came. They stood on raised platforms, preaching sermons through voxcasters while we worked. Their words echoed across the cavern, drowning in the clang of iron and the roar of furnaces. Work is faith, they cried. Labor is worship. Your sweat is his blessing. And when men collapsed under their chains, the priests pointed and declared, "See how the weak are purged. See how the emperor burns away the heretic with toil." The sisters beside them fired flamers into the crowd, incinerating men where they stood. Not many, just enough to remind us that faith was not an escape. Faith was just another chain. Swing, lift, drag, eat, drink, cough, bleed. I remember one night, or what I thought was night, we were herded back into our pens, our chains heavier, our backs broken. The man beside me collapsed, his chest wheezing, blood bubbling at his lips. He begged for death. Not loudly, just a whisper, "Please, please." The Arbites ignored him. The tech priests ignored him. Even the prisoners ignored him. He died hours later, his eyes still open. The next morning, they dragged his body to the furnaces, and the work continued. That was when I understood. The Imperium does not waste. Not flesh, not bone, not even pain. Every prisoner was fuel. Every chain was a gear. Every scream was steam to turn the wheel. And in the end, there was only one truth. We were not men. We were not soldiers. We were not even sinners. We were labor, and labor never ends. If work did not break you, if hunger did not hollow you, if the bullet, the fire, the knife, or the sermons did not claim you, then there was one fate left, the worst of them all. You became a servitor. I had seen them before, of course. Every guardsman had.
Servitors were everywhere in the Imperium, hauling crates in the holds of troop ships, wired into cogitators to process endless streams of numbers, fused into the walls of manufactorums to operate machines. They were part of the background, as common as dirt, as invisible as air. But seeing them in the pens, seeing them made in front of you was different, because you realized then that they weren't tools. They were us. It began with selection, not the random pointing of tech priests, not the interrogator's touch, not the commissar's judgment. This was systematic. The Arbites herded us into lines, chains heavy, collars sparking when we stumbled. The tech priests moved along the rows, their optics scanning, their mechadendrites twitching. They muttered to each other in Bini-Rek Cant, voices buzzing and clicking like a swarm of insects. One would stop before a man, extend a claw and seize his jaw, turning his head side to side. Another would prod his arms, his chest, his legs. Sometimes they drew blood, slicing flesh open with surgical blades to test the muscle beneath. Then they would decide. A gesture, a code string, and the man was dragged away. The chosen never returned. But sometimes, their voices did. The first time I heard it, I thought I was dreaming. We were pressed together in the pen, the air heavy with sweat and blood, when a voice rose from the corridor beyond. Subroutine, 6, alpha, confirm, flat, monotone, mechanical. It was a prisoner's voice. I knew it. I had heard him whisper prayers days before, but now his tone was empty, drained of everything but obedience. The words repeated again and again, until they were cut off mid-syllable. A silence followed that felt heavier than screams. The process was revealed to us in fragments, not because they explained it. Explanations were mercy, and there was no mercy here, but because we heard, we saw, we pieced together what scraps we could. The tech priests took the chosen to chambers deeper than the mines, beyond doors sealed with sigils that pulsed faintly in the dark. We never saw inside, but we heard. We heard drills whirring, saws cutting, sparks crackling. We smelled burning flesh and ozone, metal fusing with blood. We heard voices rise in screams, then falter, then flatten into monotones. And sometimes, the doors opened just enough for us to see. A glimpse of a body strapped to a slab, its chest open, cables fed into its ribs. A face half covered with iron, eyes replaced by lenses that glowed faintly. A skull drilled open, wires sinking into grey matter like roots into soil. And always the priests muttering prayers, not to the emperor, not to salvation, but to the machine spirit, because this was not execution. This was transformation. The first servitor they brought back was broken. He was dragged into the chamber by 2 Arbites, his chains heavier than ours, his body twitching. His mouth was gone, replaced with a vox grill that crackled static with every breath. His arms ended in clamps, his chest bore plates bolted straight into flesh. The Arbites left him in the corner. At first he didn't move. His optics glowed faintly, flickering. His body trembled, twitched, then went still. Then suddenly, his vox grill spat sound. Error, subroutine. Error, subroutine. Flesh. The word ended in static. He convulsed, clamps sparking before collapsing. Smoke rose from his chest. The tech priests arrived instantly. They didn't flinch. They didn't hurry. They opened his chest, twisted something inside, and dragged the twitching body away. They did not speak, but their silence told us everything. Failures were discarded, and every failure was another lesson for the machine. Some of us prayed for the bullet instead. We whispered to the emperor, begged him to let the commissar come. We prayed for the mercy of fire, of knives, even of the black ships, anything but the servitor process, because death was an ending. The servitor process was forever. The next one they brought back did not fail. He stood in the pen, motionless, chains binding him to the bars. His eyes glowed red. His arms had been replaced with mechanical limbs, ending in tools we didn't recognize. His chest rose and fell, but no breath came from him. When a prisoner whispered his name, Jast, a soldier I had spoken to only days before, the servitor's optics whirred, and then his vox grill spat sound. Jast, Unit 4, comply. The voice was his. Flat, drained, empty, but his. He repeated it, until the Arbites dragged him away again, leaving us in silence.
Some men wept, some cursed, some simply stared at the floor, refusing to look up again. Because we had seen the truth. The worst fate was not death. The worst fate was survival. The clever were wired into cogitators, their brains drained of thought until they could only process numbers, calculate equations, answer code. The sick were fused into the walls, their organs stripped, their bodies turned into filters, pumps, conduits. One man begged to die when they chose him. He threw himself against the bars, screaming, "Please, Emperor, kill me, kill me." The Arbites beat him until his jaw shattered. The tech priests took him anyway. When he returned, his mouth was gone, replaced with a steel plate. His voice was gone, replaced with static, but his eyes were still his, and they looked at me, and I saw him, still inside, screaming. The worst was the children. Yes, there were children here, refugees taken with their families, psychers dragged from their homes, orphans swept up in the nets of the Arbites, too small for labor, too weak for torture, too young for fire, so the tech priests took them. I saw a boy no older than 10, strapped to a slab, his arms spread wide, his mouth clamped open. He didn't scream, he just whimpered, his eyes darting, his lips trembling. The priests cut him open anyway. When he returned, he was fused into a wall. Tubes ran from his body into pipes, his chest opened and refitted with pumps. His face was still his, but his eyes were gone, replaced with optics that glowed faintly. He breathed in time with the machinery. He never stopped. That was when I realized the Imperium did not kill prisoners, it recycled them. Every drop of blood, every ounce of flesh, every thought, every soul, it all fed the machine, and the machine never stopped hungering. Some men tried to fight. One prisoner broke free. As they dragged him toward the slabs, he tore the muzzle from his mouth, spat blood, and screamed defiance. He swung his chains like weapons, shattering a tech priest's optics, breaking an Arbite's arm. For a moment, I thought he might escape. Then the clamps came down. The tech priests pinned him, drilled into his skull, and silenced him forever. He returned hours later as a servitor, his voice flattened into a monotone, his arms ending in saw blades, and the first thing he did was cut down another prisoner, not because he wanted to, because he had been told to. It was about erasing you. You were not executed. You were not forgiven. You were not redeemed. You were consumed. Every part of you, until nothing was left but obedience, and the worst part was knowing that somewhere, deep inside, a piece of you still remained, still screaming, forever.
The Imperium devoured its own prisoners without hesitation, but what happened when the cages filled with more than deserters, psychers, or the unlucky? What happened when the prisoners weren't Imperial at all? When the captives were traitors, heretics, or worse, Xenos? The answer was simple. They suffered. But the truth was far darker, because the Imperium did not simply kill them, it studied them, it displayed them, it made their deaths into lessons, and sometimes it made them disappear. The first I saw were traitor guardsmen. We knew them instantly. Their uniforms were once like ours, but stripped of aquilus, defaced with crude symbols daubed in ash and blood. Some wore charms, scraps of parchment scrawled with twisted prayers, bones tied with sinew, chains of teeth. Their eyes burned in ways ours no longer did, with either mad faith or the madness that came after it. They had been captured in a raid, brought to the pens in chains thicker than ours, their mouths muzzled, their collars sparking brighter. Arbites beat them harder than any of us, as though every strike was a sermon. The tech priests did not select them for servitor work. They said the flesh was impure, corrupted, tainted. The ecclesiarchy did not bother to preach to them. The traitors spat on priests, laughed at litanies, chanted hymns in voices that made my bones crawl, so they were taken somewhere else. The first night they arrived, the screams came louder than I had ever heard, not screams of pain, screams of worship, blood for thee. The words were cut off by bolt fire. We never saw those traitors again, but we saw what was left of them. Their heads were mounted on spikes above the pens. Their mouths were sewn shut with iron wire, their eyes gouged out and replaced with candles that burned with foul-smelling smoke. Every time we looked up, the heads stared back at us, flames flickering where their souls should have been. The commissar called it a warning. The Arbites called it justice. I called it proof. Proof that death was never simple here. Worse than traitors were heretics. Some were civilians taken from the hives. They had worshipped false gods, prayed to idols carved of bone, painted their skin with runes not found in the creed. Others were cultists dragged from tunnels beneath cities, their flesh already warped, their voices already half not human. They terrified even the Arbites. The guards didn't touch them directly. They used poles tipped with hooks, shoving them forward like beasts. Chains bound their limbs so tight the skin blackened. Their mouths were wired shut, their tongues cut out. The ecclesiarchy took them eagerly. We were marched into the burning chamber again, the pyres already stacked high with wood soaked in oils. The priests shouted sermons louder than ever, their voices cracking through the vox grills until they echoed across the cavern walls. The heretics were tied to the stakes, and then the fire was lit. They did not scream like men. Their voices rose in choruses that harmonized with the crackle of the flames, notes too high, too deep, too layered. One woman split her own chest open as she burned, clawing at her ribs until something inside her tried to crawl out. The sisters fired their bolters before it could. The flames turned the air to poison. My lungs ached, my eyes wept, my skin blistered. The priests shouted that this was the Emperor's purging light, but all I felt was fear. Because if heresy could twist a body like that, how much of it was already inside us? Worse still were the psycho-heretics. I saw one once. He was dragged in chains heavier than any I had seen, his eyes bandaged, his mouth gagged, his body shook constantly, spasms rippling through his limbs, as though something beneath his skin was clawing to get out. The black ship crews came for him. When they lifted their rods, he convulsed, his head jerking back, his body rising into the air though no chain could hold him upright. His gag split as he screamed, a sound that was not sound at all. For a moment I saw shapes in the air, shadows with too many limbs, too many eyes, pressing against the walls of reality, and then his body tore itself apart. The black ship crews did not flinch. They gathered the pieces, placed them in a container etched with runes, and carried it away. The Arbites scrubbed the chamber for hours afterward, but the bloodstains never left. And then there were the Xenos. I only saw them once, but once was enough. They were brought in chains thicker than any man's, their bodies bound with collars that sparked with arcs of lightning. Their forms were alien, slender, tall, their flesh smooth, their faces sharp, their eyes burned like glass catching starlight. Eldar, the guards cursed them, the priests spat at them. The commissar's hand never left his pistol, but they did not look afraid. Even in chains, even bleeding, even gagged, the Xenos moved with a grace that mocked us. Their eyes swept across the chamber, lingering on us prisoners, as if we were insects. The ecclesiarchy declared them demons. The Arbites declared them property. The tech priests took them. We never saw what they did, but we heard. The screams were not human. High, piercing, like glass shattering, then silence. When the doors opened again, the Eldar were gone, but the tech priests' optics glowed brighter, and I wondered what knowledge had been carved out of alien flesh. Another time, it was not Eldar, it was orcs. They were dragged in cages of iron, muzzles clamped over their tusked mouths, their green skin streaked with blood. They roared and fought, even as their chains shocked them, their laughter shaking the walls. The Arbites didn't bother with sermons, the commissar didn't bother with trials. The orcs were executed in the pits, shot, burned, hacked apart, but their laughter never stopped. Not until their bodies were nothing but piles of meat, and even then, I swear I heard echoes of it in the dark. What happened to the rest of the Xenos, the traitors, the heretics? Some were burned, some were shot, some were studied until nothing remained but scraps, but most were erased, records destroyed, names forgotten, flesh recycled, because the Imperium could not admit it ever captured them. To admit such things was to admit weakness. To admit weakness was heresy. So they vanished, and we were left behind, still chained, still waiting, still listening to the echoes of screams that did not belong to men. That was the lesson of prisoners of war. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter what you believed. It didn't matter where you came from. Traitor, heretic, Xenos, Imperium or not. The cages were the same. The fire was the same. The bullet was the same. And the silence after was always the same. Because in the eyes of the Imperium, there was no difference. We were all prisoners, and prisoners were nothing but fuel.
There are many names for failure in the Imperium. Heresy, treachery, apostasy, cowardice. But none of them stung worse. None of them carried such venom as the word deserter.
To flee the battlefield was not just weakness, it was betrayal, not just of your regiment, not just of your world, but of the God Emperor himself. And the Imperium never forgave betrayal. The first time I saw deserters brought into the pens, I thought they were already dead. They were beaten half to death, their bodies broken, their faces swollen with bruises, their uniforms ripped to rags. Each bore a mark burned into their flesh, sometimes the aquila inverted, sometimes a crude brand of a skull, sometimes just the word deserter scorched across their foreheads. They were paraded through the pens like trophies. Arbites dragged them by chains, forcing their heads high so that every other prisoner could see their shame. "Look," the guards would sneer, "this is what happens to cowards." The deserters never spoke. Not then. Some wept, silently. Some stared blankly ahead, their eyes already gone. A few snarled like animals, daring us to laugh. But none of us did, because we knew, sooner or later, their punishment would become ours too. The commissars loved deserters. They gave speeches over their broken bodies, sermons about duty, loyalty, and the emperor's gaze. They pointed to the deserters as examples, warning that weakness would be purged, that fear was the root of heresy. Then they executed them, not quickly, not mercifully. They made a spectacle of it. One commissar lined 10 deserters in front of us, their arms bound, their legs broken so they could barely stand. He walked slowly down the line, pistol in hand, speaking as he went. "Every man here spat on the emperor's mercy. Every man here spat on the blood of his brothers. Every man here chose his life over his will." He pressed the pistol to the first man's head. The deserter whimpered, tears cutting through dirt on his cheeks. The commissar fired. The bolt round turned his skull into red mist. The commissar stepped to the next. One by one he executed them, forcing us to watch, forcing us to breathe the copper stench of their blood. When he reached the last man, the deserter collapsed to his knees, sobbing, begging for forgiveness. The commissar holstered his pistol. "Forgiveness," he said, "is a lie." Then he drew his sword and cut the man's head from his shoulders. The body slumped forward. The head rolled across the floor until it hit the bars of our pen, eyes still open. We didn't sleep that night. Not every deserter was executed so quickly. Some were kept alive. They were paraded through work camps, dragged before laborers, whipped in front of furnaces, hung by their arms until their joints tore apart. The ecclesiarchy used them as sermons, forcing them to confess their cowardice before crowds of starving men. I once saw a deserter nailed to a post at the center of the mine. His body was stripped bare, his chest carved with the aquila. Every day the overseers lashed him. Every night they left him for the flies. It took him 6 days to die. On the 7th, the priests burned his body and told us that his soul had been purified, but no one believed them, because the smell of his rot lingered long after the smoke faded. Some deserters were given a second chance. That was what the commissars called it, what the priests called it, what the Arbites whispered as they shackled the deserters and dragged them away. The penal legions. We all knew the stories. Entire regiments of criminals, heretics and cowards, pressed into service with explosive collars strapped around their necks. They were thrown into the bloodiest battles, the deadliest sieges, the hopeless assaults. The collars were detonated at the first sign of hesitation. The deserters who went to the legions did not come back. But sometimes we saw their corpses. I remember one in particular. His body was dumped outside the pens like trash, half his head gone from an explosion, the collar still fused with his charred throat. His chest bore the brand of a deserter, blackened but visible. The guards kicked the body into the furnace pit. "Redemption," one of them muttered, laughing, but some deserters were not given even the false mercy of the bullet, the fire, or the legions. Some were broken in ways worse than death. I saw one man taken by the tech priests. His body was strong, but his mind had faltered. They didn't turn him into a servitor, not fully. They fused him into a machine, wiring his brain into a cogitator, his body into a frame. His mouth was left intact, but his voice was broken, repeating the same words over and over. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Day after day, night after night, his apology echoed through the chamber until the Arbites grew tired of it and silenced him with a bolt round. Another deserter was given to the sisters. They stripped him naked, chained him to the pulpit, and forced him to kneel as they preached sermons of faith. Every time he denied his cowardice, they whipped him. Every time he begged for forgiveness, they burned him. By the end, he begged for death. They gave it to him, not with fire, not with the sword, with silence. They left him chained to the pulpit until his body withered, until his lips cracked, until his heart stopped. We began to fear the deserters more than the heretics, because at least heretics had faith, twisted, broken faith, but faith nonetheless. At least traitors had conviction. Deserters had nothing. They were the mirror we didn't want to see, because every one of us had thought of it. Every one of us had felt the urge to run, to hide, to save ourselves, and seeing the deserters, branded, broken, executed, erased, it reminded us what waited if we gave in. The commissars knew that. The priests knew that. The Arbites knew that. That was why they made us watch, because deserters weren't just punished, they were displayed, a lesson carved into living flesh, a reminder that in the Imperium, there is only one path: fight until you die, or die for failing to fight. I used to believe death was the worst fate. That fire, bullets, servitor clamps, all of it was the end. But the deserters proved me wrong, because their deaths weren't just about them, they were about us. Every execution, every burning, every sermon, these weren't punishments, they were theater. The Imperium didn't just want to kill deserters, it wanted to remind us that desertion was already inside us, that every whisper of fear, every thought of running, every moment of hesitation was treachery waiting to bloom, and that the only cure was obedience. That was the fate of deserters, not death, not redemption, but to become a warning that never left our eyes, our ears, our hearts, a warning that even now, chained in darkness, I cannot forget. Because every time the guns roared, every time the fire burned, every time the Arbites dragged another body into the pits, one thought haunted me more than all the others. It could have been me, and one day it will be. The Imperium never wasted bodies. If you were too weak for labor, too stubborn for confession, too broken for servitor clamps, too ordinary for the black ships, then you were not killed. You were sent to the front, not as soldiers, not as guardsmen, not as anything resembling men. You were sent as bait, as shields, as fodder for the guns of the Emperor. It began with chains. It always did. The Arbites came in force, their boots thunderous, their shock mauls humming. They herded us from the pens into lines, shackles binding wrists, collars sparking at the neck. We were marched through corridors that stank of oil and blood until the walls themselves seemed to close around us. And then, suddenly, the walls ended. The air changed, colder, sharper, filled with smoke and gunpowder. The ground shook faintly beneath our feet, the low rumble of artillery rolling across the horizon. We had reached the surface. It wasn't freedom. It was another kind of prison. The sky was black with smoke, the earth a sea of craters and mud. Ruined trenches sprawled in broken lines. The smell of death was so heavy it clung to the tongue, and the commissars were waiting. They stood tall, their great coats unblemished, their bolt pistols gleaming. Their voices rose above the thunder of war, sharp and absolute. Prisoners of the Imperium, you have been given a chance to serve your emperor in death. Their words cut through the cold air like knives. Some prisoners cheered weakly, desperate enough to believe it. Others spat, knowing the lie. Most stayed silent, staring at the ground. The commissars continued. You will clear the way for the emperor's true servants. You will march into the teeth of the enemy and prove your worth. And if you falter, know this. Their pistols rose, bolts slammed into skulls, blood sprayed across the mud. The emperor's judgment is swifter than the enemy's. We were driven into the wastes first. The minefield stretched for miles, their markers long since lost in the churn of battle. The earth was littered with corpses, some intact, some little more than scattered limbs. The Arbites unchained us then, not as mercy. Mercy had no place here, but as necessity. Chains slowed progress, chains kept men too close together, and the commissars wanted us spread wide. March, they ordered. We marched. The first explosion tore a man apart 3 paces ahead of me. His body vanished in a spray of fire and shrapnel, his scream swallowed in the roar. The second was worse. The mine didn't kill him instantly.
It tore off his legs, leaving him crawling in the mud, shrieking until another prisoner tripped and fell onto him. The Arbites didn't flinch. The commissars didn't blink. This was the point. We were not clearing the mines. We were triggering them. Every step forward was a gamble. Every explosion meant the men behind had one less to fear. And when the minefield was finally clear, when the path was painted with blood and limbs, the guardsmen advanced. We were left behind. Those who survived the march were herded back, beaten, chained again, until the next day, until the next minefield, until nothing was left of us. When we weren't sent to minefields, we were sent to trenches. Not ours, theirs. The enemy's guns roared in the distance, their lines bristling with barbed wire and heavy weapons. The commissars pointed, their swords gleaming. Advance. We advanced. We had no weapons, no armor, nothing but our chains and our hands. We stumbled through mud that swallowed our boots, over corpses that stared with glassy eyes. Bolter fire tore through us. Shells ripped men apart. Last bolts burned holes in flesh. We fell by the dozens, by the hundreds, but some made it. That was all the Imperium needed. Even one prisoner reaching the wire, tearing it with bare hands, dying on the spikes, it was enough. Enough to mark a path for the guardsmen to follow. Enough to soak the ground with blood so the next wave could tread firmer. We were not soldiers. We were paving stones. Sometimes we weren't even given the honor of walking first. Sometimes we were chained in front of guardsmen. I remember one day clearly. The sky was on fire, the ground trembling with the thunder of tanks. We were lashed to the hulls of chimeras, our bodies spread across the plating, our arms outstretched like mockeries of saints. The enemy fired. We screamed as shots tore into us, as blood sprayed across steel. The guardsmen behind us were untouched. When we died, our bodies became armor. Those who lived were cut free after the battle, not to be freed, to be chained again for the next assault. We were shields, flesh shields, and flesh always breaks. The worst was when they gave us weapons, rusting lasguns with half-spent packs, bayonets too dull to pierce flesh, knives broken at the tip. They lined us up, shoved the guns into our hands, and ordered us forward, not as soldiers, as distractions. We charged screaming, our weapons spitting weak bolts, our bayonets bouncing off armor. The enemy cut us down like grass, mowing us with heavy fire, turning our charge into a river of blood. Behind us, the guardsmen advanced. The commissars smiled, because we had done our job, not by killing, not by fighting, but by dying loud enough to draw the enemy's fire. Some men prayed before the charges, some cursed, some stayed silent, but all of us knew. We were not meant to survive. We were not soldiers. We were not men. We were ammunition, spent one body at a time, and when our bodies were gone, the Imperium would find more. The bullet, the fire, the knife, the servitor's clamp, these were fates cruel enough. But the front was crueler still, because it gave you hope for a heartbeat, a weapon in your hand, a sky above your head, a path forward. But that hope was a lie, because every step you took was only to make way for someone else, and when your blood soaked the ground, the Imperium marched across it without looking back. The warp was not outside these walls. It was inside them. It was inside us. We didn't speak of it, not openly, but every prisoner knew. The Arbites knew. The tech priests knew. Even the commissars who spat sermons about duty knew. They all felt it. The walls breathed sometimes. The air shifted when no one moved. Shadows stretched too far, then snapped back when you blinked. The warp was patient. It seeped. It waited. At first it was only dreams. Not the usual nightmares of blood and fire and screaming, but something different. Too clear. Too sharp. I dreamed of places I had never been. Cathedrals taller than mountains. Oceans made of glass. Cities burning in silence. I dreamed of faces without eyes. Mouths without teeth. Voices that whispered from throats that were not mouths at all. I dreamed of standing at the edge of something vast. Something alive. Something that looked back at me. Other prisoners spoke of it too. Some muttered in their sleep. Their words carried on voices not their own. Some woke screaming, their bodies slick with sweat, clawing at their eyes as if to tear out what they had seen. Some did not wake at all. They lay in silence,
Their faces twisted into Richter smiles, their eyes wide open, staring at something that only they could see. The Arbites ignored it. The tech priests muttered binaric prayers and tightened chains. The commissars declared it weakness of faith. But the warp did not care for their denial. It spread anyway. It began to show in the bodies. A man's shadow moved when he didn't. A woman's voice echoed even when she whispered. One prisoner's skin shifted in the light, patterns crawling across it like writing too fast to read. Another's teeth fell out and regrew every night, sharper each time. We whispered that they were cursed, that they had been touched, that they had been marked, and yet they were still among us, chained to the same bars, breathing the same air, waiting for the same judgment. The Arbites grew more violent then. Shock mauls cracked more often. Whips lashed deeper. They thought pain would drive the warp back. They thought breaking bodies would break what whispered inside them. But the warp thrived on pain. Every lash fed it. Every scream gave it breath. It was night, or what passed for night here, and silence pressed down heavy. Then the air shifted. I felt it in my lungs first, a pressure that made every breath sharp. Then the lumen overhead flickered, its light stretching shadows that writhed like snakes. One prisoner convulsed, his chains rattling, his body jerking, his mouth opened but no sound came. Instead, a light poured out. Not bright, not holy, sickly, green and purple and black all at once. The Arbites rushed forward. Their mauls cracked against his body, electricity sizzling through flesh. He did not stop. The light grew stronger, leaking from his eyes, from his skin, until his body split apart like wet cloth. Something stepped out. It had too many limbs. It had no face, only a mouth that stretched across its whole form, lined with teeth that glowed. Its scream was not sound, it was thought. Every man in the pen dropped to his knees, clutching his skull, shrieking as the sound drilled into our heads. Some bashed their foreheads against the bars until blood ran. Some bit through their own tongues. Some simply convulsed, their eyes rolling back, froth spilling from their mouths. The Arbites fired, their shotguns roaring. Bolts tore chunks from the thing's body, but it did not bleed. It laughed, the sound scraping inside our skulls until my vision blurred with red. The commissar came. His pistol thundered once, twice, 3 times. Each bolt round exploded inside the creature, tearing it apart. It screamed again, the sound collapsing into static, and then it was gone. Nothing left but a smear of blood on the floor where the prisoner had once been. The commissar turned to us, his eyes burning. "This is what awaits heresy," he snarled. "This is what awaits doubt." Then he left. But I knew he was lying, because the warp did not come from heresy. It came from being here. It came from the chains. It came from us. After that, manifestations became common, some small, a whisper that echoed too long, a face in the corner of your vision that vanished when you turned, fingers brushing your shoulder when no one was there, some large, a man whose chest burst open to reveal a mouth that screamed until his lungs collapsed, a woman who dissolved into mist and seeped through the bars before vanishing into the walls, a child who laughed until her body split into 2, then 4, then none. The guards fought them. The priests burned them. The tech priests harvested what was left. But the warp did not care. It only grew stronger, and we were chained, unable to run, unable to hide, forced to watch as the cracks widened. The worst was when it infected the air itself. One day, the chamber filled with a humming, soft at first, then louder, deeper, shaking the walls. Our teeth rattled, our bones shook, men screamed as blood poured from their ears. The humming turned into words, not spoken, but felt. Let go. Some prisoners obeyed. They stopped struggling, stopped screaming, stopped moving. They sat in silence, their eyes empty, their chains loose around bodies that no longer resisted. The Arbites executed them instantly. Bolts cracked, blood sprayed, bodies collapsed, but the humming only grew louder. Let go. It pressed into me, into my skull, into my chest. For a moment, I wanted to stop. I wanted to fall silent, to give myself to it, to let the warp carry me away, but I didn't, because I was too afraid, not of the warp,
but of what would happen if I listened. Some men began to worship it. They whispered that the warp was not death, but freedom, that it would take them beyond chains, beyond bullets, beyond fire, that the Emperor was just another jailer, and the warp was escape. They carved symbols into their skin. They sang when tech priests dragged them to the slabs, and when they died, their bodies burned with light. I don't know if they were right, but I know they were not afraid, and that made them more dangerous than any heretic. That was the truth of the warp's pull. It did not need to break chains. It did not need to kill guards. It did not need to burst through walls. It only needed us, our fear, our pain, our silence. The warp seeped into all of it, fed on it, grew fat on it, grew fat on it, and when it was ready, it would not just whisper, it would not just bleed into dreams, it would not just stretch shadows, it would open, and when it did, the Imperium's chains would mean nothing, because the warp was patient, and we were already halfway gone.
They told us there was redemption. They told us that the Emperor's mercy stretched even to the lowest, to the broken, to the damned. They told us that even we, the chained, the beaten, the forgotten, could earn our place again. But in the Imperium, mercy is never mercy. It is another word for suffering, and redemption is just another way to die. A story whispered to frightened deserters, a cautionary tale to keep us silent. But then the Arbites came, and the priests followed, and they began selecting men from the pens. They marked them with ink on the forehead, numbers that meant nothing to us but everything to the guards. Then they were marched away. Some cheered, some spat, some begged to be taken, but most of us just stared, because we knew to be chosen was not a blessing. It was a death sentence written in numbers and sealed in blood. We learned soon enough what it meant. The penal legions were not soldiers. They were not guardsmen. They were meat dressed as men, thrown into battles so hopeless that even commissars flinched at the orders. Their collars carried explosives, detonators wired into the hands of their commanders. One thought of retreat, one moment of hesitation, and their heads burst like melons. The Arbites called it redemption. The priests called it penance. The commissars called it useful. The truth was simpler. It was slaughter. I saw them once, deployed to the front. 100 prisoners marched with lasguns that spat more smoke than fire, their collars blinking faint red. They ran screaming toward a wall of enemy fire, their bodies torn apart before they crossed half the distance. The few who reached the trenches fought with desperation, stabbing with bayonets, biting with teeth, clawing with fingers. None came back. When the smoke cleared, the commissar stood before us and smiled. "Redemption," he said. I realized then that the penal legions were not meant to win. They were meant to waste lives. Every body they threw forward was one more breath saved for the true soldiers. Every death was a brick in the Imperium's wall. But not all prisoners went to the legions. Some were taken elsewhere. Those the ecclesiarchy deemed worthy of repentance were given over to their sermons. They were forced into confession halls, where light never dimmed, where priests shouted prayers until their voices bled, where men knelt until their bones cracked. Some emerged with eyes full of fire, screaming praises to the Emperor until their throats tore. Some never emerged at all. Those who survived were marched into battle with purity seals nailed to their skin. They were called redeemed, though nothing in their eyes looked redeemed. Their faith was not conviction, it was madness. I once saw one of them chained to the prow of a tank, purity seals fluttering in the smoke. He sang hymns as shells exploded around him, his body riddled with shrapnel, his voice rising until it broke into laughter. When the tank finally detonated, his body was still singing. The sisters saw us as blasphemy made flesh. Our crimes were not cowardice, not treachery, not desertion. They were sins, and sin could not be tolerated. It could only be burned away. The sisters took men and women alike, stripped them, branded them, and forced them to march with banners of flame. They carried relics too heavy for their bodies, their backs breaking beneath golden icons. They were sent into battle, not as fighters but as martyrs. And when the fire consumed them, the sisters sang hymns of joy. There were whispers of another path, a path darker still. Some prisoners were taken not to battlefields, not to churches, not to sermons, but to black ships that loomed in orbit. Those were never seen again.
Some said they became psychers, their souls fed to the Emperor on terror. Others said they were fuel, sacrifices poured into the warp to keep the Imperium alive. All I knew was this: they were gone, and in the Imperium, gone was often worse than dead. The Arbites loved to speak of choice. They said prisoners had two paths: redemption or ruin, serve in the legions, die for the Emperor, earn salvation, or refuse and face execution, torture, servitor clamps. But that was no choice. Redemption was ruin. Ruin was redemption. Both paths led to the same end. We had no say. Our chains chose for us. He had been a soldier once, or so he claimed. He had scars to prove it, a voice like iron, and eyes that did not flinch when commissars shouted. He told us that if chosen, he would fight. Not for the Emperor, not for the Imperium, but for himself. When his time came, he was branded and collared, marched into the Penal Legion with the rest. I saw him again weeks later, dragged back to the pens. His body was half burned, his collar fused to the charred skin of his neck. His Lars gun was still clutched in his hand, its stock cracked, its barrel bent. He looked at me then, eyes hollow. "There is no redemption," he whispered, "only ruin." And then he laughed, a broken, jagged laugh that echoed long after the guards dragged him away. That was the truth. The Imperium never spoke. Redemption was not for us, it was for them. Our deaths redeemed their failures. Our suffering redeemed their faith. Our ruin redeemed their need for blood. We were not men. We were not sinners. We were not soldiers. We were currency, spent one body at a time to buy another moment for the Imperium. And when our bodies ran out, they would find more. The Imperium never wasted bullets if a lie would do. They never burned a body if a word could bind it tighter than chains. They did not always beat us into obedience. Sometimes they gave us something worse. They gave us hope. It began with whispers, not from prisoners, but from guards. Arbites leaned against cell bars, their shock mauls resting casual, their voices low but loud enough to reach desperate ears. They spoke of clemency, of release, of hidden paths where obedience might lead to freedom. They said some men had been pardoned after service, sent home to their worlds, restored as citizens of the Imperium. None of us had ever seen such a man, but the story spread like fire through dry timber. We clung to it, because what else could we cling to? The chains were real, the lashes were real, the screaming of the damned was real, but the possibility, the faint glimmer that maybe there was a way out, that was stronger than steel. Then came the lotteries, once a month, sometimes once a year, depending on how many bodies the front devoured. The commissars announced a lottery of redemption. Names were drawn from lists carved into slate, scrawled on parchment, tattooed on forearms. If your name was chosen, you were called forward, unchained, and given a chance. The Arbites smiled. The priests praised the Emperor's mercy. The prisoners screamed in desperate prayer, begging to be chosen. But a chance was not freedom. It was something crueler. Some were sent to the penal legions, their collars blinking, their deaths inevitable. Some were fed to the ecclesiarchy's sermons, their minds broken beneath ceaseless prayers. Some were handed over to the mechanicus, never seen again, their bodies recycled into something less than human. And still, we prayed to be chosen, because it was better than rotting in the pens, because maybe the stories were true, because maybe someone, somewhere, had walked away alive. But hope was not only given, it was engineered. The tech priests brought machines into the pens, screens that flickered with grainy images of worlds we had never seen. Green fields, open skies, cities with lights that stretched forever. They told us these were worlds of the Imperium, worlds that awaited us if we served. Some men cried, some fell to their knees, some kissed the ground, begging the Emperor for a chance, but I looked closer. The skies never moved, the cities never changed, the same people walked in the same patterns, again and again. They were not worlds, they were recordings, old, looped, recycled, until their lies grew thin, and still, men believed. They told us our chains were temporary, that our suffering was proof of his love. They promised us that if we embraced our pain, if we died with his name on our lips, we would rise again in light. Men wept, men screamed his name, men kissed the boots of their tormentors. I saw one prisoner carve the aquila into his chest with his own fingernails, bleeding in the mud, smiling as he whispered prayers. When the Arbites shot him for disobedience, the commissar nodded. That, he said, is true redemption. Sometimes the hope was smaller, crueler. A guard would slip a crust of bread to a starving man, telling him more awaited if he obeyed. A tech priest would promise lighter chains if the prisoner endured the pain of their clamps without screaming. A commissar would offer a whispered word, "Serve me well, and I will remember your name." But the prisoner still believed, because he had to. Hope became a weapon sharper than any blade. It kept us walking into minefields. It kept us tearing our hands on barbed wire. It kept us screaming the Emperor's name as last fire tore our bodies apart. Because if we stopped hoping, if we stopped believing that maybe there was something beyond this, we would fall silent, and silence was dangerous. A hopeless man had nothing to lose. A hopeless man could rise, could fight, could bite through his chains and strangle a guard with his dying breath. But a man with hope, he would kneel forever. I remember one day when they tested this fully. The commissar announced that a prisoner would be released. One prisoner, chosen for his loyalty, his endurance, his faith. He called a name, and a man stepped forward, trembling, weeping, thanking the Emperor with every breath. They unchained him. They led him past the gates. We watched, silent, straining to see what lay beyond. He walked into the light. He did not look back. And then, hours later, his body was brought past us again, headless, shot through the skull. The commissar spat at his corpse. He tried to escape, he said. This is what happens to those who waste the Emperor's mercy. We understood. There was never a release. There was never a way out. There was only hope given to us like a drug, used to bind us tighter, then torn away when it had served its purpose. That was the Imperium's true genius. Not in their guns, not in their chains, not in their sermons, but in their lies. Because lies do not need steel. Lies do not need blood. Lies do not need fire. They only need belief. And belief was endless, because we had nothing else. The commissars did not fear uprising. The priests did not fear heresy. What they feared was truth. They feared we might see through the lies, might see that there was no hope, no freedom, no redemption, that the Imperium was not salvation, but a maw that devoured forever. Because if we saw that, if we believed it, if we accepted it, then hope would die. And when hope dies, fear dies with it. And when fear dies, chains break. It was burned into us, beaten into us, whispered into us, until we could not separate it from breath. Even when I told myself it was false, when I spat on their lies, when I swore I would not kneel, I still dreamed. I still wondered if maybe 1 in a million did walk away, and that was enough. Enough to keep me silent, enough to keep me chained, enough to keep me walking forward into fire. Because the Imperium did not need us to believe fully. They only needed us to doubt our despair, and that was the sharpest chain of all. There is only so much a body can endure. There is only so much a mind can bend before it splinters. Chains hold flesh, fear holds thought, lies hold faith, but everything breaks eventually. Even the Imperium knows this. That is why they watch us so closely. That is why they keep the Arbites walking the pens. Why the commissars never sleep. Why the priests drone sermons until their throats bleed. Because they know. One day the prisoners will break, and when they do, it is not quiet, it is fire. The first signs are always small. A man refuses to kneel at prayer. A woman spits on a priest's feet. A prisoner bites a guard's hand when the shock maul comes too close. Tiny rebellions, sparks swallowed by the lash, drowned beneath blood. But sparks grow, sparks spread. I remember the day it happened in our pen. The Arbites came to take another name for the penal legions. They dragged a boy forward, a boy no older than 16, chains too heavy for his thin wrists, eyes too wide to understand. He begged, but they did not listen. The priest raised his hand to bless him, and the commissar's pistol gleamed at his hip. Then the boy's father lunged. He was half-starved, his ribs sharp as knives beneath his skin, but desperation gave him strength. He slammed his chains into the Arbite's helm, shattering the Vox mask, sending the guards sprawling. For a moment, silence froze. For a moment,
Every prisoner held their breath. Then the pen erupted. Chains whipped like blades. Men and women surged forward, shrieking, spitting, biting. Guards were dragged down into the mud, their shotguns torn away, their armor clawed open by desperate hands. The priests screamed hymns as they were ripped apart. Even the commissar staggered, his pistol roaring, each bolt round tearing holes through bodies, but still the mob pressed closer. It was madness. It was fury. It was the breaking point. For the first time, I saw fear in the guards' eyes. They were trained, armored, armed, but there were too many of us. Hunger gave us claws, rage gave us teeth. Chains became whips, shackles became bludgeons. The pens that had kept us divided now became cages for our captors. The commissar bellowed, his voice iron even as his pistol clicked empty. He drew his blade, its power field hissing, cutting prisoners in half with each swing. But for every one who fell, two more pressed forward, screaming, bleeding, not caring, because in that moment, hope was gone. And without hope there was no fear, and without fear there was only rage. Rot. We broke the pens, we spilled into the corridors. The Arbites fell back, calling for reinforcements, their Vox units hissing with panic. Alarms wailed, red lights flooding the halls. The whole prison shook with the sound of riot, of chains rattling like drums, of voices raised not in prayer but in fury. I saw prisoners tear down a priest and beat him to death with his own censer. I saw a tech priest dragged screaming into the mob, his mechadendrites thrashing until they snapped one by one. I saw a woman bite through an Arbite's throat, spitting blood as she roared. It was not a battle, it was slaughter, and for a moment, for a heartbeat, it felt like freedom. But the Imperium does not lose, not here, not in their own cages. They let us burn for an hour, maybe two, maybe less, just long enough for the fires to spread, for the fury to taste victory, for us to believe it might last. And then they sent in the enforcers, not Arbites, not guards, enforcers. They came clad in carapace blacker than night, visors glowing with cold green light, weapons humming with power. They did not shout, they did not hesitate. They advanced in silence, and everything they touched died. Shock mauls burned through bone, stubbers roared, their fire cutting lines through the mob. Grenades burst in fire and shrapnel, tearing prisoners apart in screaming chunks. One prisoner tried to rush them with a stolen shotgun. His collar detonated before he closed the distance. His body fell in pieces, smoke rising from what was left of his neck. The riot broke, not because we wanted to stop, not because we lost the will, but because the enforcers did not tire, did not bleed, did not falter. They were machines of flesh and faith, and against them we were nothing. I was dragged down in the chaos, my face slammed into stone, my mouth filled with blood, a boot pressed on my spine, and I waited for the bullet, but it did not come. The enforcer only tightened the chains, wrenching them until my bones screamed, and then moved on, because that was the truth of the breaking point. We were never meant to win. The Imperium knew we would rise. They knew we would break. They let it happen, because every riot was a purge, every rebellion was a cull. Those who lived proved themselves useful. Those who died made room for more. The survivors were changed, not freer, not stronger, just fewer. The guards walked the pens afterward, their boots crunching through blood and bone, their laughter echoing. The priests sang hymns of victory, their voices trembling with exhaustion and terror. The commissar returned, his blade still dripping, his eyes colder than stone. This, he said, is what rebellion brings. We listened in silence, not because we believed, not because we feared, but because we had no strength left to answer. Some prisoners whispered that it was worth it, that for a moment, for one burning hour, they had tasted freedom, that even if it ended in blood, even if it ended in chains, even if it ended with their bodies stacked like firewood, it had been worth it. Others said it proved the truth, that we could never win, never break, never be more than fuel for the Imperium's endless fire. I did not know which to believe. All I knew was this: the breaking point comes for every man, for every woman, for every prisoner, and when it does, the Imperium is ready, because they do not fear our silence. They do not fear our obedience. They do not even fear our rebellion.
They fear the day we rise not with hope, not with rage, not with despair, but with nothing at all. The day we rise without care for freedom or death. The day we rise because we have nothing left to lose and nothing left to believe. That is the day the chains will break for real, and that is the day the Imperium praise never comes.
The aftershock did not end when the last scream bled into the drains. It kept humming in the steel, a low, unpleasant music that made the bars itch and the bolts twitch. You could feel it in your molars like a storm that never quite decides to break. The riot had been a flare in a starless sky, brief and terrible and almost beautiful. Its light went out, its heat remained. They answered with precision. New chains, shorter by a hand, new collars, heavier by a prayer, new manacles with barbed teeth inside the cuffs so that thinking about struggle became the same as bleeding. The Arbites walked with tactician's patience, counting the number of steps between each pair of boots and then shaving a step off anyway, as though distance itself needed discipline. The enforcers lingered at corners like punctuation marks you could slam your head into and still not move the sentence. No speeches. The ecclesiarchy had burned its throat hoarse, praising victory, and discovered the throat was not needed. The commissar did not shout. He only stood, hat brim razoring the lumen bleed from above, and let the bolt pistol at his hip pronounce the period to any conversation that tried to begin. Silence settled like dust, thick enough to write your name in and then watch a boot erase it. We rebuilt the habit of breathing, the habit of looking without lifting the head, the habit of sleeping in half minutes that pretended to be hours because they arrived in tidy stacks, the habit of not imagining the door where a wall lived. Habit is a kind of mercy that tastes like rust. It lets you continue without believing you should. The pen smelled different, not clean. Clean is a rumor in places where light goes to die, but the riot's copper tang had thinned into a bitterness like old rain in a gutter. Stains were shaved off the floor with the careful disgust of men who prefer their filth uniform. The ceiling kept the smoke anyway, holding it the way a miser holds coin no one knows he owns. New prisoners arrived, as they always do after a cull. They came with the same faces we once wore, small astonishments, hard edges of disbelief, the inward sway of animals learning the fence with the nose. Some asked questions. Where is my unit? Where is my wife? Where is the officer who said I would only be interviewed? We gave them the truth that fits through bars. You are inventory. Numbers answer better than names here. Learn yours. The tech priests appeared more often, humming the machine's canticles with a satisfaction they did not trouble to hide. Riot is data. The cogitators had eaten their graphs and wanted seconds. Priests laid hands on collars to feel how the pulse changed when a man thought about running. They redrew talk values like benedictions. They tuned shocks to sing in the key of confession. Selections resumed. They did not pretend to be random anymore. A slate on a folding table, a column of numbers that meant mine, line, trench, altar, slab, ship, 50 to labor, 20 to the front, 12 to the sisters, 8 to inquisitorial custody, 4 to conversion, 2 to special transfer. The last phrase moved through the pen like a cold finger. We pretended not to feel it. Pretending is the last freedom that does not draw fire. They took the boy whose father had begun the riot. He did not look back. Maybe the new collar refused the angle. Maybe he had learned that looking back invites a mouth to open. Maybe the worst, that he had converted the lesson of forward into a faith. They took a woman who had braided a rosary from scabs and thread. They took a man who could still laugh without sounding like a machine testing a broken gear. They took a worker whose palms would not stop healing fast enough for the overseer's liking. Flesh that refuses to be a ruin irritates men committed to demolition. We who remained learned a new liturgy, not the ecclesiarchy's ours. It is an inventory of names. We pass them one to another as if they were cups of water too full to lift without spilling. We swallow them when a boot stops near. We keep them at the back of the tongue so a lash will taste memorial when it draws blood. Names are a tool in a place that distrusts tools. Names make a way where shackles insist there is none. The commissar orchestrated a ritual of erasure and called it record keeping. He set up a cogitator on a crate, fed it lists with brass teeth, and ordered us past it in columns. A quill scratched, a ribbon clicked, a red stamp fell. The stamp said resolved. It sounded like a verdict learning how to purr. Men who had died in the riot were resolved. Men who had burned, been shot, been torn open for lessons, had their status updated with the same neat pressure. A priest muttered that the emperor loves order. The cogitator whirred like a hymn, and it was decided that grief should be legible only in triplicate. Afterward came the quiet, not the soft quiet you hear in cellars where bread cools, the quiet of suppressed machinery, the quiet of horror that has completed its task and gone to sharpen itself for the next. Even the warp's whispers seemed to move a few steps away, as if insulted. Shadows remembered their borders. The lumens buzzed with bureaucratic dignity. The building pretended to be a building again, not a throat. Work returned like a season. The mine's mouth yawned. The furnaces spoke their single sentence in heat, over and over. Overseers counted with the care of men who have misplaced children and found numbers to be the only antidote. We lifted, carried, broke, dragged, coughed, learned exactly how many inches a collar allows a back to bend before it bites. Some collapsed, some were permitted to be dragged aside, some were given to the machine to become quieter versions of themselves. All of it fit back into the ledger as if the riot had only been an enthusiastic footnote. In downtime we forged the smallest rebellions, the kind that passed beneath iron's notice. A shared sip sent 3 bodies down the chain with the angle of a cup. A cough that meant step now, not later. A stutter in a prayer that meant the guard to the left has begun remembering his old dog and will not notice a glance. The vocabulary of survival is a grammar of wrists and throats. We spoke it until our muscles conjugated one another. Stories returned. They always return where sleep is rationed. We told them faster, with less ornament, because ornament lingers, and lingering earns interest we cannot pay. We told stories that were lies useful enough to be treated like tools. We told stories that were true in the only way that matters. They made a man's breath change shape. The best story was a small one, stray as a starved cat. Sometimes the slate scribbler makes an error, a loop left open, a digit that fails to close. One prisoner rides a cage, a cogitator forgot to imagine. He reaches a door that expects no name. He steps through. The story never explains where. The story does not need to. It makes the air taste different for a heartbeat. The warp, insulted or satisfied, receded into the masonry's throat. Dreams kept their wrong angles, but stopped bleeding. The most spectacular untruths of flesh gave way to the ordinary untruths of paperwork and power. Men still woke with eyes too wide. Women still felt hands on their shoulders that turned out to be air. Children laughed in a way that made collars warm. But the building ceased to flower, nightmares like mold. Somewhere, someone had decided demonstration was no longer required. Then special transfer returned. You can feel certain arrivals without hearing them. The air stiffens like a sheet being tucked too tight. The guards' visors show a color that tastes like old coins. Priests powder their brows with ash and pretend it is humility. Tech priests unfold devices that make the air smell for 3 seconds like rain, remembers itself, and then like dust's revenge. The figures wore no badge we recognized. They carried authority like a lantern carries its own darkness. They took 2 men whose names we had already learned how to keep, which is to say they selected carefully. When they left, the commissar opened a velvet box and set a pair of laurel wreaths on a table as if mocking someone at his own funeral. He did not crown anyone. He crushed a leaf in his fist and let the crumbs fall. Honors rendered, he said. A priest tried to laugh and discovered that laughter, like faith, requires oxygen. Days braided themselves back into an obedient rope. We wore it around our throats and called it time. It is not unkind. It holds you up as readily as it hangs you. We learned to step into and out of its coils without drawing attention. We learned that there are hours that will not hold weight. You pass them like bridges that dislike your feet. The stray story kept following me. I fed it nothing but glances. It licked the salt from the place on my palm where iron had worn a crater down to shine. On the morning when the convoy arrived, even the floorboards changed their rhythm a hair, as if making room for a number not accounted for. Cages were prepared, gates greased, clipboards preferred. We were called and counted and corrected. The stylus slipped. It could have been light on metal masquerading as error. It could have been the hand of a man who wanted to believe he was no longer precise. It could have been grace. The loop did not close. A digit remained a mouth. The guard frowned at a cogitator that refused to spit me back.
"This one is redundant," he said. "Redundant is a holy word here. It means I could be removed without changing the sum." The gate opened. "To run is to write a confession with your legs." I walked. The yard felt like the surface of a thing that had forgotten the sea lives under everything. The officer pointed to a door that pointed to a corridor that pointed to a desk where a form waited to turn me into a man assigned to a dock that did not exist. The power failed. Power fails everywhere at once in places like this. It is never really about electricity. It is about a heart deciding to skip a beat to savor the next. The building held its breath. Somewhere, a priest began a hymn he did not believe. Somewhere, an augury engine apologized to its saint. Somewhere, a bolt pistol was drawn as punctuation. In the dark, my hands found a latch a fraction left of the one I had been sent to. The power returned like a cough from a lung that wishes to be forgiven. The guard swore softly, a word that wanted to be a plea. "Hurry," he said. It sounded like kindness putting on a uniform. We stepped into the hall. A figure was waiting. Not robe, not plate, not black carapace, a worker's cloth that did not accept its wearer. Eyes that were lenses with a memory of eyes behind them. Joints with the wrong patience. A servitor that had kept a corner of the man he had been for one purpose and one alone. He lifted a hand. "Stop." The guard obeyed without knowing why. The figure turned and limped into a stairwell whose mouth had not been there yesterday and would not be there tomorrow. The stairwell smelled like the refuse chute after rain that never falls. I did not follow. I am not proud. I am not ashamed. I am still here. The match he had kept lit inside himself burned out somewhere in the throat of the building. The place breathed. The ledger corrected itself. The error closed. I went back to the pen and slept the way a man sleeps on a raft that knows the tide and trusts it not at all. Stability returned with its quiet, boring dignity. Selections, labor, sermons, front, fire, conversion. The chair on the platform gathered dust no one dared wipe away. The priests acquired a second hymn about discipline that tried to rhyme with victory and did not. The enforcers studied our routines until even they grew bored with our predictability and then punished us for it anyway. The warp muttered in its corner, like an old soldier correcting a new map. Sometimes we marched past the spot where the uprising had begun. The flagstones had been shaved down until even the stones felt embarrassed by their smoothness. The stain was gone. If you stood there and let your tongue find your teeth, you could still taste metal shavings and a sweetness like burned fruit. Memory seasons air. The boy's father went to the stake before dawn, on a day when the fog looked like milk gone wrong. He stood as if he had invented standing. He did not beg. He did not curse. He looked at the crack in the roof where sky makes its one lawful visit, and did not blink. The priest lit the wick. The fire learned his name and used it with a tenderness no living person in this place had shown him. He made no sound. I have decided that was not surrender. It was a refusal to perform for the ledger. New prisoners learned quickly. They always do when instruction is paid for in blood that still glistens. They hid their questions in their gums. They learned the short steps that let the chain hang comfortably between bodies, as if it were simply a tired necklace shared by friends. They learned to drink so that a mouth 3 souls away receives a blessing through cups and timing. They learned the micro gestures that say more than shouts. This is how a church starts without ever confessing it is one. We carved nothing now. The walls store too much. We breathed our grammar. The twitch that means bend your wrist. The blink that means wait for the guard's boredom to turn its head sideways. The micro shrug that means I will take your weight for 3 seconds and you will pretend to be lighter than air. We spoke a language of small salvations. We archived it in muscle memory because parchment burns so beautifully. Not all names survived. Men's memories were replaced with drawers labeled subroutine and error. Women's faces learned how to wear the word purified until it cracked. Children forgot the verbs for things that do not happen here, like running for nothing, like laughter that does not brace for the lash. We kept teaching the names. We hid them in jokes the guards could recite and never hear. We braided them into a work song that has no melody and lives entirely in the way your back times its pain with the next lift. One evening the commissar placed a chair on the platform and sat. He did nothing for a long time. We have a dozen kinds of silence now. His was the sort that makes a space into an altar without admitting it. At last he stood. "The Emperor does not forget," he said, and left. The chair stayed. "The Emperor does not forget," he said, and left. The chair stayed. The chair is a trap. The chair is a promise. The chair is a prophecy written in wood that does not know it will be burned later for proof. I have become a scholar of noises that precede violence. The soft scrape of a boot pivoting. The throat clearing of a shock mole's gain climbing. The breath an arbite takes when he cannot decide whether to love cruelty or hate himself for needing it. I can tell you the exact instant a blow will land, and the exact number that will follow. Every man here can. It does not save you. It only lets you occupy each millisecond, as if it were a room you could leave. Sometimes that is enough. Faith did not die. It changed address. Some days it rents a room inside a bead of water cupped in a palm. Some days it sleeps behind a name and pays in memory. Some days it lives in the way two men lift a beam with the tenderness of midwives. The priests hate that kind. They cannot tax it. They cannot set it on fire and call the smoke incense. So they ignore it, and it grows. At night, when the lumens grow tired of pretending they are suns, the pen sings, not with words. Words are commodities. Words are contraband. We sing in breath and teeth, and a rattle so soft it could be mistaken for a rat crossing a thought. It isn't ours. It belongs to every mouth that has learned to survive by refusing to declare a tune. If you were outside the wall and pressed your ear to the stone, you would hear it and think the building had learned to purr. You would not be wrong. Men keep vanishing. They always will while the numbers balance. Some go to the front and return as smoke. Some go to the sisters and return as ash shaped like sermons. Some go to the machine and return as tools that whisper their names through grills when no one is listening. Some go to special and do not return in any direction. We do not howl. Howling is for people who think distance does not help. We archive. We annotate. We encode. We put a name in the place of a brick so that someday, if a wall ever falls, someone will read. I was selected again. Labor, the slate claimed. I read a different gloss beneath it. Loop. Back to the cavern. Back to the hymn written for backs. Back to the sentence heat speaks. Across from me a man glanced, and the glance contained a congregation. We lifted in time. We let our hands pass information about slack and strain the way friends pass bread. We finished the shift, and for 1 minute after the whistle, pain did not belong to anyone. If you are expecting escape, you have been listening to the wrong storyteller. Escapes are doors and this place loves circles. But circles scuff. Every revolution picks up grit. The hum that grit makes is not loud, but it is not nothing. I have chosen to become grit. It is not glorious. It is stubborn. It refuses to be polished out. It adds friction that numbers mislike. After count this evening, the commissar walked alone. He stopped at my bar. He looked at me as if trying to reconcile me with a figure that keeps failing to add properly. "You are still here," he said. For a breath I heard an unarmored man inside the iron shell. "So are you," I said. For a breath I heard a voice that used to belong to me before chains taught it new grammar. He moved on. The chair on the platform continued to refuse to be sat in. The boy, the one who no longer has a father except in names, sleeps 3 cages down. He asks me sometimes about rain and wheat, about laughter that does not hitch as if expecting to be slapped, about mornings that begin with birds whose wings belong to them alone. I answer cautiously. Truth is a chain if you don't file its teeth. I teach him names. He teaches me to listen to the gaps between names as if they are rooms. Tomorrow a convoy arrives. I can feel it the way a dog feels thunder through floorboards. The building anticipates with bureaucratic hunger. New faces will enter the alphabet of this place. New throats will learn what iron tastes like when it becomes a tongue. We will pretend to be stone while they pretend to be birds, and then we will trade shapes until both pretenses feel like skin. I am tired. Tired is not surrender. Tired is material. You can build with it if you place supports at the right intervals. Supports are names. The span is the day. The river is the mouth that wants everything and will have it and cannot help itself. The bridge sways. We cross anyway. No one is coming to carry us and I refuse to be dragged. This is aftermath. Not ash falling like grey confession. Not the ledger claiming neutrality while it sharpens the knife. Not the speech shined with certainty until it reflects lies back as stars. Aftermath is the practice of standing without thanking iron for the lesson. Aftermath is counting breaths in a room that believes it owns your lungs. Aftermath is promising your blood that if it must be spent it will buy something larger than fear. This is silence, not empty but crowded with breath withheld, with hymns swallowed, with bolts chambered in reverence. It is the sound a chain makes when it imagines for one heartbeat that it is a word and chooses the price and refuses to pay. It is the quiet between two names when a third might arrive and you decide not to summon it because hunger has asked you to keep it company instead.
We live there. We are not stone. We are not smoke. We are the voice that stays inside the mouth and waits for the wall to crack. If any of this escapes, under a door, in the margins of a manifest, in the static that rides between one order and the next, do not waste pity on us. Pity is a flower that wilts in places like this. We need roots. Take a name. Take two. Speak them aloud to someone who will hear. Write them where a machine will have to read them. Hide them inside a joke and tell it until it becomes a prayer. Thread them through your breath. When you kneel, kneel on them so the floor remembers. And if you want more, if this descent into the Imperium stomach held your breath and did not let it go, do not pretend that silence is kindness. Stand with us in the next descent. Subscribe so you do not miss the next voice. The walls learn to make. Like this so the cogitators that count the world will have to count us. Share it with the friend who devours truth and the friend who fears it. Comment with the one image you cannot wash from your eyes, and the one name you will carry where numbers cannot follow. Bring that name back here. Add it to the litany. Make the ledger choke. We will be here, breathing. We will be here, counting. We will be here, memorizing the shape of your footsteps when you come back with more names. The aftermath lasts as long as memory. Help it last longer than iron.